Hello and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Heart of the Cast. My name is Farfa, of course, joined by the co-host.
Hello, it's me, Josh.
Hi, Josh, and we have a super special guest here today. We've got Matt Bell. Introduce yourself.
Yay, good to see you again. My name's Matt Bell. Whoop, just careful with the microphone there. I used to work for Calamities Entertainment. I worked on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card game for about 9.5 years. I worked closely with R&D. I was a product manager. Best described as kind of a mix of a little bit of like what Kevin Stewart was doing, a few other people in the US, and Jerome. My job was the European markets. I worked on things like Forbidden Limited lists, new card sets, product design. I worked with a lot of people. We were a small team in Europe, so we even like when it was all hands on deck kind of stuff, like for the World Championships. On more than one occasion, I booked Josh's flights to Worlds.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So yeah, no, because it's just basically everybody was trying to organize those events. So it's just like, right, get the players to Worlds, and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool. So I'm booking flights now.
You didn't book
So
any of
cool.
my flights.
How many times do you go to Worlds?
Well, that's not the point.
Oh, my apologies. My apologies. The invite must have got lost in email.
Yeah, it must be in the spam folder.
Yeah.
So what we can basically take away is all of this is your fault.
I usually get blamed for a lot of stuff like this, or at least I used to. I haven't been with the company for a couple of years, so I can't take any responsibility for anything after Toon Chaos, I think was the last set that came out when I left. I
Toon
think that was like
Chaos.
2020.
What is
Okay.
that? Around 2021?
It was definitely a COVID
Yeah.
set, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that was a crazy time to be in the industry for sure. The complete opposite happened of what you would expect in terms of the demand. You're just like, oh, nobody's going to be going to stores, maybe reduce the orders, and then the exact opposite happened where it's like, hey, we need like more cards than you have. So that was a crazy
Mm-hmm.
change of what we were expecting to happen.
A big boom in everything across the board.
Oh yeah. The secondary market I think did really, really well during COVID. You know, COVID was an awful time, but there were plenty of people that made out like bandits.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm getting from this is we have discovered this incredible side quest for today to find out what exactly to blame you for and what not to blame you for.
Sure, I'm more than happy to go for it. We can talk a bit about some of the work I did on design and kind of my principles of how I look at things.
Yeah.
For the viewers at home, I will make it clear that I can't talk about stuff that would be covered by my NDA. I saw when I was on MPT stream, quite a few people were saying, "Why didn't you ask how the Forbidden Limited list is made, or how do you make these things?" And so the internal processes for Konami, that's still protected information. So
Mhm.
I'm not going to get myself into trouble, and I don't want to get anybody else into trouble. But it's not that the hosts don't want to know; it's that I can't tell you in some cases. But I will talk about the stuff that I'm confident won't get me sued or otherwise.
Yeah, so you are, of
Obviously, yeah,
course,
we're
under
gonna.
a permanent non-disclosure agreement, just to clarify with everyone. And I suppose before we start deep diving into everything, I'm sure you have some shout outs to make, Matt, so feel free to plug your stuff.
Yeah, sure, of course. Thank you. So I'd like to promote my game that I'm going to be releasing with my new studio. So after leaving Konami, I went on to work in video games for a little while and then consulting, and I've moved into opening my own game studio. Our first game is going to be Robot Raiders. It's a tabletop card game. It's for 1 to 4 players. The idea is that you have one player. It's like an asymmetrical PvP game. So one player is playing an overpowered deck, and you've got 3 players that are working together to try and beat that player. For Yu-Gi-Oh players, I guess if you want to understand sort of like the turn order and the dynamic, if you think of Bonds Beyond Time with Paradox versus the 3 main characters, and you do turn orders like that, that's kind of the gist of how the game flows. In our game, you have traditional RPG classes. You've got Mage, Paladin, and Ranger, which you can see on our banner here. Um, and you all have different abilities, different cards. And as you go through the dungeon, you're going to be adding new cards to your deck. You're going to be gaining new abilities. So these will be cards that change how your cards work or improve certain things. And there's a lot of deck building, and a lot of strategy and teamwork involved with it. And it was really exciting to try and build something that's a little bit different from your usual one-on-one kind of card game that you'd have against other people. So we just wanted to make something that kind of a team game that also worked as a solo experience. So if you're completely by yourself or you just want to play cooperatively, because not everybody wants to be the bad guy or the monsters, which you see on this banner, uh, we wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to do that. So you can play. The game has a set of rules which tells you how to play through completely on your own, and the monster will interact for itself. But it's really, really fun. We were actually just on a northern port of the UK. Sorry, I say northern because that's kind of an insult to far, far when I say as far north I went as Manchester. But yeah, we were just up there in Nottingham, the Dice Cup Cafe. We were in Sheffield, Patriot Games, and we were in Manchester, Fanboy Free. We did a lot of demos, got a lot of great feedback. Our test scores were all above 8.5 on every metric for people that was enjoying the game in our demo build. But if you do want to find out more about the game that I'm working on, if you head over to www.robotraiders.com, you can sign up to the mailing list. You can take a look at some of the artwork and a little bit more information about the game. We automatically send you, when you sign up to that mailing list, a print to play demo. So you can just cut that up into sleeves and try it out with your group. You also get a tabletop simulator digital demo if you prefer to play online, and there's all the rule book and everything's there. And on our Discord server, I'm there. I do demos every Tuesday. So if you've got a play group and you're like, hey, I want to learn to play, I'll personally give you a demo, and you can catch up with everything on our Discord. So that's where I'm at in my life right now. I'm really excited to be
Yeah,
launching this on Kickstarter a little later this year.
yeah,
It's
that sounds
very
exciting.
Yeah, that sounds really cool that you have like I think it's a big jump to go from like what I assume was a very comfortable job and then pursue your like clearly your passions like that. That's really awesome.
Yeah, it's been scary. I won't lie. Going from when you get like a regular paycheck and you can kind
Mhm.
of plan for stuff into figuring out how you go ahead developing and marketing a product like Robot Raiders and trying to solve the things because like normally when you're in Konami, it's like try and figure out logistics. Like how do you get the products, the components that are being made in China to Europe? You've got a team for that. You say, oh, logistics will handle that. Well, I am logistics now, so it's kind of like I've got to figure out how that works and all the kinds of stuff that you've got to get, how you get it through customs and all of these extra things that you just don't normally like think about. I've got like little bits of experience with it, like some of the toy taste testing and stuff like that. Sort of, you got to make sure that if somebody eats it, they don't die and stuff like that. And it's all these little extra bits that you've got to figure out in addition to actually making and developing the game. But yeah, it's been quite the ride, and I've learned a ton so far. And I'm really hoping this goes well. I've staked my life on this, so yeah.
No, that sounds like very commendable, just the amount of time, effort, and courage to take on an undertaking like that. That is honestly super impressive.
Yeah, best of luck
No,
with that. I hope the game
appreciate it.
is very, very successful, and I might eventually try it out when it officially releases. If I understood that correctly, it's still in a Kickstarter, the demo phase,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to be launching our Kickstarter a little later this year, ideally. The
Mhm.
way that Kickstarter works is you have to bring your audience to Kickstarter, and if you're successful, then they promote you. So you
Mhm.
can't just kind of show up on Kickstarter and expect a bunch of traffic
Ooh.
or a bunch of people to find your game. Yeah, Kickstarter makes money when you are successful, but
Okay.
um, if you bring your own community there, you're more likely to get that funding initially, and people that will then attract other people. So we're in the process of doing our marketing, trying to get as many people as possible to play the game and come test it out. Everyone who has tested it's really enjoyed it, and you don't have to wait for the final release. We do have our prototype available, so you're always welcome to hop on Tabletop Simulator. I'm more than happy to show you how it all works if you do want to give it a little bit of a preview.
Online simulator, huh? Hmm.
Oh yeah. I appreciate in your community you're not allowed to talk about that kind of stuff, right?
Oh
How does
no,
such a
we
thing work?
we
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand that concept.
I no we play online simulators all the time for non Yu-Gi-Oh. Like there's lots of leeway for that. That's no problem. Um, but yeah, that sounds really cool. But I just have like one question about it. It feels very casual, which I suppose is good. Like it seems like it's just something you pick up, play with your friends. Let's do a boss battle, basically. Um,
Mhm.
do you think this has tournament potential and like competitive like potential?
So it's kind of interesting. When we started building this, we wanted it to be a standalone experience that you could just buy this with a group of friends and play. And we've got multiple different difficulties to scale it up. So if you've got a group
Mm,
of YCS level players, you can make the game extremely challenging for the free
mm,
players against the one, or you can tone it right down so it can be entry level. For tournaments, it was never sort of intended to be played as traditional tournaments, as much as the game kind of mimics a trading card game. Managing and organizing huge scale tournaments across the country that have qualification processes and stuff like that is kind of beyond the scope of what was intended for
mhm.
this game. So I guess by the TCG player standards, you could consider this more of a casual game that you sit down and play with people. Organizing a huge number of events and stuff is it's a whole department in Konami, organized play team,
Yeah.
and they have them in different regions. So that's not we've not really built the game with the tournament's intent. But if you're in a local store and you decide actually we want to figure out who's like the best monster player in the store or stuff like that, there's room for people to figure that out. But we've not
Mhm.
initially planned for it to be that along those lines of that traditional for TCGs.
Yeah.
All right, sick. Well, for those of you interested and do want to give it a peek, especially for physical demos, if you're in the UK, then we'll leave all the relevant links and stuff in the description. So please do check out Matt's game. It does sound very interesting and very innovative. I think is definitely how I would class it. That's super cool. All right, let's get on to some of the juicy topics here. Card design, 9 years of Konami making the game. I think I did want to talk a little bit, I suppose, about the Forbidden Limitless, but I mean, obviously that's like kind of like specifics and stuff you can't really go into, so we can talk about that a little bit more in principle. Starting with card design, I suppose. Do you want to maybe just like take it away and explain like how do you approach like making a card? What thought process goes into designing a card or a deck altogether?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so basically every designer kind of has like a different way of approaching the game. You've got some people that can just look at it very competitively focused and say, these are cards that tournament level players will want, and you can design from that perspective of like, how do we influence this particular thing that's happening in the game right now to sort of move the format around? Or you can, which is kind of where I focus, which is like, how can you thematically make something that feels fun? And so there'd be like different themes where you'd be thinking like, how do you get the fantasy of this to work? Like for example, like with Noble Knights, it was like, okay, they're all going to have these noble arms. They're going to be pretty durable, and the objective is to get Artorgus and just equip him with a million weapons. And it's like that's cool when you've got someone that kind of reminds you of like Cloud Strife with all of the weapons in his Buster Sword. For people who watched Advent Children way back when, maybe showing my age a little bit there. Um, and I kind of really like that fantasy where it's more so about whether or not people can have fun playing with the cards. Like, does it do something in their fantasy? Like, are they going to be able to tell stories when they play this card versus necessarily like, is this going to be a $150 secondary market tournament level card? And there's value in developing the game in that sense, but ultimately the craziest thing is it comes down to like the competitive players will ultimately decide what's good. So you may as well make the game make as much fun as possible and let the players figure out what to them is going to be competitive. That's the way I approach it. That's not necessarily all of my opinions are reflective of my own personal way of approaching it, and there's plenty of other people that have different points of views. But that's like the way I generally appreciate things because our playtesting schedules, as I've mentioned before in other interviews, is that on the very first day of release, you guys will play way more than we ever have time for in the office, and we'll figure stuff out. Min-max, and you've got the spreadsheet people that are going out and like selling like this is how you play this newest deck and all the math and numbers and everything behind it. And I think it's fun to let the players figure that out as opposed to sort of cramming it down their throats and saying you will play Dark World or something like that. Okay, that's a bad example. I don't think that's ever happened with Dark World, but sort of like when you cram themes down their throat, I think that's kind of I don't think that's the right way. I won't say that's never been done, but it's not
Yeah.
the right way that I would approach game design or card design.
So you're saying your main focus when designing cards is not the competitive viability, but rather like the gameplay style, how it feels to play a certain deck you want to portray, or give players a certain feeling when they're trying out a new archetype or anything like that.
Exactly. Like that's the kind of things that I focus on. Like, and some of the products that I worked on that are probably less popular with your community will be things like the star packs. These were very
Mhm.
cheap packs that came out years ago. They were intended to support the fans of the anime.
Mhm.
I don't think any competitive player ever really took those products too seriously. But we did extraordinarily well with them. They resonate with a lot of people where
Yeah.
they could watch episodes of the anime, then go and be like, "Hey, cool! Like this, I saw this on TV this week. Very successful in Italy and across Europe." We ran those series for quite a long time, and that kind of stuff was like some of the areas that I worked on. There was also like the advent calendars, which most people would probably think is again another product that didn't really changed the competitive landscape, but
Mhm.
were super successful in their own right. The Karibo calendar was my personal favorite one that I managed to put together,
Yeah.
and stuff like that, which makes Yu-Gi-Oh like Yu-Gi-Oh. That's kind of I guess
Yeah.
that's kind of like what I really enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to realize that, of course, the competitive scene, while it seems very important to us who are part of the competitive scene, is not all there is about Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Like, I don't even know how the percentage of the competitive players versus the casual player base are just like fans of the anime that occasionally buy a couple cards. Like, it's probably very small, right? So,
Yeah.
how important would you say is competitive balancing even like to the success of a product? Like, does it have to have a bunch of really powerful cards, or is it more about bringing cool archetypes that people just want to play with, regardless of whether they're going to be meta or not?
It's a combination of both. The
Hmm.
competitive players are extremely important. Those are the
Okay.
people that are going to give you feedback. They're going to be people that show up to your tournaments. They're going to support you. And in the long term, they're going to go on and start YouTube channels and various things like this. So
Yeah.
those people are very important. You kind of need to hit a balance between the two. If
Hmm.
you can get away with making a fans only kind of set for the fans, but the competitive players just won't touch it because they're going to be looking for what's the EV on opening a pack
Yeah.
versus other people that may just be like, oh, cool, I want to get some more Dark Magician cards or
Yeah.
things like that. But the competitive balance is very important. You do want to keep an eye on it, and it's a big challenge with a game like Yu-Gi-Oh, where it's just like no rotation or anything like that. Where I just think something you put in the format kind of stays there forever until you address it with a Forbidden Unlimited list.
Yeah.
So every time you're doing like your testing, sort of almost that pool of oh god, we need to check it against this, check it against that kind of thing, just gets like bigger and bigger. But the competitive side is extremely important, but it's also good to remember that so many of the casual players that are buying those other projects are kind of funding the budgets that go into
Yeah.
those organized play events. So if you do see some casuals at your local store, you can just pat them on the back and say, "Thank you for paying for my tournaments." Yeah, that's some nice thing you can do for those guys. But they are a very important part of the ecosystem as well as the competitive players.
I
Hmm.
do want to ask, you mentioned the theme and how the role of, I suppose, like the lore of a card plays into like mechanically how you build a deck. And I think one thing that definitely stuck with me was how you decided to design the dangers. Maybe you can retell that for people here, and also um, if you have any other cool examples of that.
Wait, you made
Ah,
dangers?
no. That
Oh, okay.
um,
Okay, we're denying the
there's a
allegations
whole
right
team.
away.
So
Sure.
Well,
first of
not you
all, when like
specifically, but
Okay.
yeah, just to be clear, but there's like a whole team that develops these things. There's the R&D in Japan. There's the R&D team in the US. There was me in Europe. But like for the danger theme, the idea was, what if you did like a hide and seek theme, like where you've got to try and find them, and then that sort of led into cryptid. The guy who came up with this, I remember he was telling me we were having drinks after a meeting in the US, and I was like, oh my god, this is absolutely brilliant, and they completely nailed it. But the idea was sort of like this hide and seek theme
Hmm.
that you would then show them the cryptid and then sort of hide it in your hand, and then they've got to try and discover the cryptid. And that was just like a really cool idea that also ultimately ended up flopping on top of an incredibly powerful series of cards. But the core of like, would it be fun if was actually built into that.
Yeah.
And it turned out that it also happened to be like massively successful with the player base.
Yeah.
But how could it not when you consider at that time it was a very easy way of like drawing for your deck very quickly.
Hmm.
You got lots of materials and stuff like that, and they were all dark monsters, so they resonated with a lot of existing support.
Yeah.
But sometimes like inspiration can come from something as simple as that. Like, can we do this?
Yeah.
Other times you could be more direct, like Dark Ruler No More. The idea is that it was like a stopwatch, where it's like if your opponent set up this field where you can't play anything, you could play this stopwatch, which would pause the table, so you have a chance to try and break through. You can't win the game, but
Hmm.
it gives you an opportunity to get through. That was a card that I helped work on.
Yeah.
And originally, the idea with the theme of like pulls, can I break the field and then continue playing, was sort of the design principle behind that card. But that was with the competitive scene in mind, where
Yeah.
okay, the current field is set up a bunch of an unbreakable field, and you kind of can't play the game. So it's like, well, what if we kind of add an access to that, so it's not a sure thing if you do set up these kinds of fields? Like, how do you move the needle so it goes from unbreakable field versus unbreakable field?
Hmm.
When
Yeah, I
you
mean the entirety of that 2019 tin feels like it was, or the promos in that 2019 tin felt like they were designed to counteract the speed at which the game was starting to go, especially the boards that people were making on the first turn, right? When you think of Nibiru, Dark Ruler, and Shifter, now not one out of those three has aged, I think, worse than the other two, but I feel like all three of those have been made to counteract the power of the first turn. That's very much how it felt
Yeah.
like. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly kind of where we were at with those 10 cards, and
Yep.
they resonate with the players really, really well. I hear people aren't too much of a fan of Shifter,
Yeah, that's the one I
but
meant. Yeah.
uh, but yeah, no, but the idea of like changing kind of where the game was competitive, really giving people tools to try and experiment with things a little bit different,
Hmm.
was some of the goals with that.
I do want to ask, you mentioned the sort of like that theme as like the driving force between design, but there has to be some decks where there is a very specific intention of like, okay, this is going to be strong. We want this to be really powerful. That's a very deliberate process, I assume, right? Rather than, okay, here's like a bunch of cool effects. They happen to be good, rather than, okay, we want this to be good. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, of course. Like you look at something like Necrol's from way back when, or Shadol, and there's no way that you could not look at those and say these are a step forward from where we are in terms of power level. And sometimes those come along where there is like a intentional. How do we move the game forward, or how do we move one of the focuses of like players' attention to something? So
Hmm.
that does happen in those cases. Those cards do come out much more powerful because they're in consideration of what decks around that level would be able to do and what the expectation is. Things have probably changed quite a lot since I was working on it, because the game was a lot slower when I was working on the game versus to
Just a
where it
little.
seems to be uh, now. I actually tuned into Joshua's stream yesterday just to sort of catch it a little bit. And I saw you playing a game of Labyrinth, and there was this there was so much going on in the game, and it's like I couldn't really track what was going on with the cards. And
Yeah.
I saw you just kind of get up and walk out when the I can't remember, your opponent drew like one card or something, and then the game completely flipped. So it looked like you kind of got it under control,
What was
and
the
you were just
card,
like,
Josh?
ah,
Was it circular? Like, what
No,
card was it?
it was a wanted, I think, off the top of my head. When I had like, obviously it had to have been Snake Eye, because I don't know. I spent like 5 turns or something trying to control the game with the Labyrinth trap deck, and then they just top deck wanted, and I just, yep.
So when
yeah. And
go on.
oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was gonna say, and that kind of stuff is kind of weird to me because
Mhm.
decks should run out of resources. And when I was watching that, I was like,
Oh no,
how does
they
his
don't.
opponent just keep going field after board after board after board? I'm like, you get one and you mess that up, you should lose.
Yep,
Like, so the game's changed.
yep.
Uh, so yeah, just to call back a little bit to what you said about how, like, there's like that step forward you take with something like Shadal's and Necros. Um,
Yep.
did you ever think, like, in an overarching type of way, well, there has to be some kind of endpoint here, right? Like, we've always described this arms race that exists in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where decks get more powerful, therefore the counters to decks have to get powerful. That's a good example of the tins, for example, all those
Yeah.
cards being created. Then in order to beat those cards, we now have to design cards that are better than those cards in the tins. So is there like a long-term plan, or was it always just kind of take it set by set? Or like, do you ever think about how, like, there is that sort of infinite power creep almost, it seems like?
Yeah, that infinite power creep cycle is something that was always on your mind, and it makes things very, very challenging, because it's like, how do you make interesting cards that people are going to care about if you don't keep sort of raising the bar?
Yeah.
And ultimately, as much as the players don't necessarily like to hear it, the game is a business, and there's a lot of people whose jobs depend on whether or not people enjoy products that come out. So if a new set comes out and people are absolutely hate it, it's completely unplayable. Not Secret Forces, was it Secrets of Eternity or something like that, which turned out to be okay in the end with the Infernoids, but it came out around the same time as Secret Forces. Those things are kind of problematic. Um,
Yeah.
and Yeah, no, it is a real problem with the constant power creep, and it's very I'd say it's very easy to make a good competitive card, but there's plenty of times where I feel like you probably shouldn't. The more generic it is, the bigger a problem it's going to be. So you kind of use a soft rotation, which is you theme lock everything, and then once that theme has hit a certain point, you just stop releasing cards for it, and eventually over time, it will sink back in. And then if you still have to address it, you go to Forbidden Unlimited list. And then as time goes on, you can eventually start releasing some of the limits on those themes. So you can sort of bring them back into the competitive game. But
Mhm.
you there's a difference between there's this kind of weird thing to explain. We've got a difference between game design and product design, and both are very important. Like you want the game to be fun for people, but you also need people to actually want the cards, want the game to continue, and they kind of sometimes clash a little bit. And that's when you can end up with this never-ending power creep, which seems to have hit like an all-time high. Somebody was telling me that some people play 50% hand traps in their decks at this point, which
Something
Yeah,
like that. Yeah.
yeah, that's like another thing that I guess I wanted to get your opinion on is like the reason for that currently is that they've started to for some archetypes they've started to condense a lot of power into one singular card, and they've given you the ability. Snake Eye is an example of this. Without going too much into detail, the deck basically has 15 versions to access a certain combo via just one card, and therefore and that ends on an incredibly powerful field, even off of just that one card, in a way that you can just play the deck with 20 what we call non-engine cards, right? Like hand traps.
yeah.
And you can afford to actually play that many because if you draw a hand of like 4 hand traps and just one engine card, in that deck it's actually not a problem. Like whereas in like most historic Yu-Gi-Oh decks, those hands would be doing incredibly little, right? You would just be summoning a monster and passing, or maybe doing a little bit of a combo, but nothing super crazy with one card. And a lot of these or some of these modern archetypes can just do a whole lot out of just one or even two cards, enabling them to play that many hand traps in the first place, right?
Yeah. See, that's really tough because then any new theme that you kind of want to introduce into the competitive scene
Yeah,
needs to be as efficient as that, or more
yeah,
resilient to the hand traps that are getting played. And
exactly.
it starts to then really date cards really, really quickly because you could be looking at cards from maybe 2 years ago that are just considered unplayable based on the fact that they are not efficient enough to keep
Mm,
up with that kind of play. And that that becomes really difficult from product perspective.
mm,
That you end up having to use like the Forbidden Unlimited list, I guess, to resolve that issue because you don't want to be printing cards more powerful than that. At least I wouldn't want to print
yeah,
cards more
that's
powerful.
what we're trying to figure out is, do we even want to consider the possibility that they'll make archetypes that are just more powerful than that, or do we maybe need to take a step back? But I feel like
I
historically there's been times where Konami's must have realized that we need to take a step back. Like I'm trying to think of like times where one example I recently read somewhere was how we went from 2013 Dragon Rulers and Spellbook of Judgment to 2014 hat format where suddenly people were starting to set a monster and two traps again, right? So there's been times in this game where we have taken major steps back in terms of like the speed or the power level of the game. Or you think of like 2018, what people have been doing with Goki cards, and then we go to 2019 and suddenly it's like Sky Striker again is like a very dominant force in the game, or whatever, right? So I feel like something like this isn't impossible to reverse, right? If they just set their mind to it.
Yeah, there's certain ways of doing it. Some ways are popular, other ways are not. For
Hmm.
example, link summoning completely changed how you use the extra deck when it first
Yeah.
came out because you could
Hmm.
only summon synchro or fusion monsters to zones that your link monsters pointed to.
Hmm.
That pretty much invalidated so many of those older themes because it was so much harder to use to just flood the field, and a lot of the old archetypes just kind of didn't work. That's kind of I guess an unpopular way of solving the problem.
Hmm.
Uh,
Interesting
and
you choose the word unpopular.
Well, that's I guess in that case, you're taking away the fun from a lot of people because it's like, well, my deck no longer works anymore because you changed the
Yeah.
core rules of the game. It's not like
Yeah.
I lost a card, I can find a replacement, or I can look forward to some immediate new support that's going to promote me. It's just like all of a sudden, my deck
Hmm.
doesn't do what it used to. Well,
Yeah.
the core game has changed, and very heavy-handed way of manipulating the players essentially into trying new things.
Yeah.
And you could tell when, sorry, I'm choosing my words very carefully here, when the new master rule came around and all of a sudden you could synchro and fusion summon like normal, like you used to be able to in the good old days. And that kind of shifted. But there's definitely ways of doing it, and seeing things like go to the hat format. That was kind of very advantage driven. I remember that was the first year we started streaming, and I think the North American WCQ had top four was hat, and I think in Europe we had four hat in our top eight.
Mermel.
Dragon Ruler like Sworn, Mermel, Bujin, and Spellbooks, I think
Yes.
it was.
Yeah.
And none of the hat decks in Europe made it
Yeah,
through.
they
But
all lost.
that was probably one of my favorite formats of the game because it was just so varied and you could play
Yep.
so many things.
So the reason I touched on that very specifically when you said unpopular was I found 2018 to be a very confusing time because I think the majority of competitive players did not super like the level of this critical mass of power that we had reached with multiple different types of FTKs proliferating the format. But the paradox that I saw with that is every single event was record breaking. Every YCS that occurred in that occurred in 2018 was breaking records for attendance. It was the biggest NAWCQ, it was the biggest EUWCQ. So I found it like almost paradoxical. Well, a lot of players seem dissatisfied, but yet they're coming out in droves to attend these events, and I that's just a big question mark in my head.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think one of the things we can never underestimate is how much people love Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, if this is your hobby, a big part is I travel to these international events, I meet with my friends, I want to make a name, I want people to notice me at my locals. I like collecting cards, and the game is very good for that. I think in terms of like the community for making people actually love the brand and love the community and want to stay in it. Yu-Gi-Oh is very, very good for this. And a huge part of traveling to a lot of these events is just hanging out with your friends because at the end of the day, only one person wins that weekend officially. There's plenty of other people that do well on Top Cut and stuff, but there's so much more to it. Traveling to events is fun. You get to go to a new country, you have a laugh, you have stories to tell. Even if you scrub out, there's people that go to tournaments for formats they absolutely despise, but they'd still go because it's time with their friends.
Yeah. And I think one other
And
way, or one other thing that I just thought of that may explain the discrepancy between like unpopular game changes and still popular tournaments is that not every change needs to be super unpopular with the competitive player base, but maybe more so with the casuals, which overall still makes it like a change that's not great for the health of the game or the business, right? Because something like the master rule change in 2018, was it, or at end of 2017, I think, um is something that maybe at the top level of competitive play it successfully slows down the game, but it does so at the cost of like quote unquote ruining so many like casual decks as well, right? It's not something that only affected the top level of decks that were getting out of hand. It's also something that like ruined whatever casual deck you can think of that was just trying to summon a couple synchros next to each other, right? Like nothing problematic at all, but still gets like caught in the stray of that change, right?
yeah, you can go back and probably look at uh, Japanese Twitter around that time
Yeah.
for how unpopular that was and how much sort of flack was coming as a result of
Mhm.
that. And yet, the competitive game doesn't necessarily always reflect the whole of the market sentiment. The competitive players are probably the most dedicated and will travel to stuff, but you've got so many people. Wizards of the Coast used to call them the Invisibles. They'd go to a store, they'd buy their packs, they'd go home. You get them in no data, you have no tracking, you have no idea what they do. They don't necessarily interact with your social media.
Yep.
They just play with their circle of friends.
Mhm.
They spend a lot of money, but you don't really know much about them unless you're actually in the store and you start talking to them and stuff. And you can notice it when they start to get unhappy. They don't necessarily rage about it on Twitter. They just stop showing up. They stop
They
buying
just
stuff.
spend less money, yeah.
And you start going, oh, sales are going down. What's
Yeah.
going on? You know, like
Yeah.
that would be like your indicators, like, okay, stuff's going. So I've got again be careful with what I'm saying. But you can see, you can get access to that kind of data and sort of make interpretations of what
Hmm.
the sentiment is and what's actually happening.
Yeah.
It's such a, I think, very difficult and almost scary thing to identify, right? I think like one of the a saying is like, the worst thing that someone can do to you is not hate you, it's forget about you type of thing, right? And I think it's like that apathy towards the game that feels very insidious and very difficult to identify. And I suppose the only way to track that metric is sales numbers, I suppose, right? But then again, it also opens up a bunch of other questions because, well, what if it's also competitive players who aren't buying the product? What if it is like your core competitive players who have moved away from the game? Like, I don't know how you identify that or how you track that.
Sure. Sorry, I've got to stop. I remember last time I did an interview with you, I kept saying sure, and that was all the comments were saying over and over. So I've actually spent the last several years trying to not keep doing that, funny enough.
No,
If
don't
you want to
But
worry
move
about
away
those.
from a specific topic or anything because you feel it's getting too specific on NDA, absolutely feel free.
no. I'll say when I get there. I'm collating my thoughts a little bit, but you can look at like the different parts of the market will move, and that will give you indications on who's feeling what necessarily. Competitive players you get data for, you can see in the
Mhm.
back ends of all the tournament software, like how many people are signing up, um, what stores are running events, sort of how many people are showing up every weekend. With the players that aren't vocal, you kind of your only indication is whether what sales are, and but then that gets a little bit complicated. For example, if more competitive players are buying products and casuals aren't, then the numbers will look the same. But you realize you're kind of losing a segment of the market. It's two different ecosystems, and
Mhm.
this is why digital games like Master Duel is so great because you can see everything. You can check the retention. I can see how often you're logging in, how long you're playing, what you're buying. All of that data, it just goes directly into spreadsheets in the back end. And someone like me would be like looking at it and then making decisions. Whereas with the physical game, if people really get unhappy, like you said, the whole indifference is they just disappear, and the numbers will lag. So, because of how far ahead you're working, that you'll eventually just kind of find out that these people have kind of just sort of shifted away, and you're like, oh, I wonder what happened there.
Mhm.
Can you attract enough new players to compensate for that? And I think Yu-Gi-Oh, from my experience, one of the biggest problems with Yu-Gi-Oh was the onboarding of new players.
Mhm.
But I guess that's kind of sort of moving away from the topic
Yeah.
in that sense. But yeah, it's two
Nothing's
ecosystems that are
changed,
very
honestly.
delicate.
Just to let you know, from my experience, not much has changed in that regards. So yeah.
Yeah, it's
We,
kind
we
of
we've been seeing some efforts. I don't know if you've heard of the two-player starter set that they've made.
Yeah,
Um,
I saw. I actually worked on one of the original two-player starter decks that we launched in
mhm.
the TCG, which was the Yuya and Declan two-player starter deck.
Mhm.
So that was taking sort of like a Japanese product and saying, "Hey, what if we get these two decks that people can play?" But the problem always has been the difference between playing a starter deck game and any game of Yu-Gi-Oh is just so
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
that it's massively intimidating
Yeah.
for new people to play.
You can tell that they tried. I feel like they tried to work on it because the two-player starter set that they made this year is like you're not supposed to shuffle it when you're using it for the first time. It walks you through a like a tutorial booklet where you draw your
Mhm.
cards in a specific order, and it introduces like a couple of extra deck mechanics too. The only issue that I personally have is that, or like for me, it's impossible to evaluate how good it is, obviously, because I'm looking at it from a perspective of I've been playing for 20 years. So it'd be very interesting to know. And once again, it's probably something where it's very hard to get solid statistics on because you don't know how many people actually started playing because of that, how many actually got into it because of that product. I guess you can look at the sales number of that product, but that still doesn't tell you exactly how successful it was and like what the conversion rate was of how many people actually bought it and then actually bought more stuff.
Exactly. And ultimately, you got to remember, a company like that big, you will see your sell in, you won't see your sell through. So necessarily, you'll
Mhm.
know how much you put on the shelves, but you won't get 100% numbers of how many people went into the store and actually bought the product that you could track the
Yep.
data for.
Yep.
So you try and find tricks for that, like adding QR codes and stuff like that, saying, "Hey, check this out," so you can come download
Mm.
the rulebook digitally and stuff, and then you can see
Yep.
well, how many people scan those QR codes, and you can get some information about that. You try and find clever ways to feed that data back, but
Mhm.
onboarding has been a problem has been always a bit of a challenge. because the starter decks don't appeal to core players unless you put really powerful cards in them, and then
Yeah.
casual players don't necessarily understand the really powerful core cards unless they're very open-ended and simple and very and ridiculous, which then causes a problem with long-term game balance.
How do you reach the like from a Konami standpoint, how do you reach the conclusion that player onboarding is a problem when competitive tournaments have been growing so much in recent like last 5 years or something? Is it something where you look at it and you're like it should have grown more, or is it more so onboarding of more casual players rather than competitive players?
Yeah, if you're looking to onboard casual players, because competitive players, you
Mhm.
can see how many of them you can say that they've hard converted if they've signed up for a KCGN number. Like
Okay.
immediately when they enter the system, you're going, okay, that person obviously cares enough about the game that they entered a tournament. That's a huge
Okay.
um, investment, essentially, from their side, a huge indicator of interest that they're going to continue with the game. And it is again down to those kind of invisible people. I guess
Mhm.
the thing is you can talk to stores, you can sort of track, and you can sort of look at sort of what your entry level products are and how they're doing. But
Mhm.
you are making your best educated guess when you
Yeah.
don't have hard data. Like you can go up and talk to people and say, "Hey, how come you've never tried playing Yu-Gi-Oh?" And people say, "Oh God, that game looks crazy complicated." But
Mhm.
that's just one person's opinion. So it's like, how do
Yeah.
you extrapolate from that beyond that? And that was kind of one of the challenges I tried to sort out with speed dueling. It was trying to find a way
Mhm.
to onboard people.
Yep.
Um, and trying to get that get it back to simply the fantasy of Yu-Gi-Oh! And saying, "Hey, come try this. It's in a smaller, controlled environment." And people would essentially play Speed Duel, understand the game, and then move into buying like tins or other products, and then they'd go into tournaments and
Okay.
those
So
kinds of
Speed Duel
things.
was meant to be like an onboarding tool rather than its own thing that someone just plays Speed Duel, or maybe
It
a little
was
bit of both.
it was designed for both, right?
Okay.
The idea that you could learn the game and then choose to
Mhm.
stay in the Speed Duel pool, or you could learn the game and then go into the stores and buy other stuff because you're like, okay, cool, I understand the fundamentals of the game. I want to go ahead and try these other formats, or maybe I'll play a mix of both Speed Duel and um, regular format.
Mhm.
So it was designed to sort of be an on point that you could get into at any stage. And this is something I think pretty much every game needs to keep in mind. Is like if somebody showed up and said that looks cool, how do you get that person to start playing your game like at that point where you are in your release cycle? What's going on? Like how does that player join? What product would you recommend that they buy? Like where do they
Mhm.
start?
Mhm.
And that's a question that I think everybody should be asking all the time as you're growing. Like you just want to get people in.
Yep.
Um,
So
yeah, sorry, I think that's kind of finishes that thought.
no, no, that's very insightful, honestly. I suppose I did want to maybe talk a little bit more about like design principles and stuff because there's a bit of product and stuff here which is all very interesting. Um,
Yeah.
so I wanted to maybe ask about like going first and second. It's a bit of a strange, I think, maybe question because I think for most of the time that you're around, going second was actually optimal for like 2 or 3 years or something. I think one of the things that definitely resonated with me is like when you design a game, it's like, do you design it for the player or do you design it for the opponent? And I'm just curious, like, in recent years, basically TLDR, we've seen this huge fixation of going first and how powerful that is.
Mm.
You did mention a little bit about the 2019 tins and how that is there to fix going second. But what is sort of the ways that I think you deal with that problem? Um, and what are good
Yeah.
design indications of fixing that problem?
So Yu-Gi-Oh has always had the problem that going first has been significantly better than going second. Even though weirdly, if you wanted to go second in almost every circumstance, you have control of that. If you win the coin flip, you can choose second. If you
Mm.
lose a coin flip, your opponent's probably choosing first. If you go all the way back to even the origins of the game in the Invasion of Chaos format and stuff, having access to play your trap cards first was such a huge advantage because they were a much bigger part of the game back then. And then as we move forward, it came to comboing into different boards that would then prevent your opponent from playing cards. That was always way more powerful than actually then trying to set up through all of that negation. Um, it's always been a difficult one because just the way that Yu-Gi-Oh is structured, that going first is generally always better unless you build your deck specifically to go second, which we kind of moved into an era where that became a thing. But this is something I've kind of always had problems with game is I think that both players should at least get to play the game. And
Mhm.
I'm not necessarily a fan of heavy negates that basically hinder your opponent from actually doing anything. You go, during my opening hand, okay, cool, opponent takes a turn, I'm dead. Like, I can understand the appeal of that to some players. Personally, it's not what I would want from a game that I was playing where I'm like, oh, I'm dead when I looked at my opening hand. Um,
Mm.
and I guess from a design perspective, the way you could solve this problem is, well, you could see where they made the player going first can't attack, and you draw one less card, so you have less resources available to you, placing limitations on what the turn one player can do. But if you go too far, the damage output for Yu-Gi-Oh is insane. You can one-shot somebody. The second you get a window, there's so many decks that will one-shot you that you don't want to tip the value too far into the first battle phase decides the game. So it is a really big challenge to juggle to try and make it fun for both players. And I guess you can play around with different mechanics to figure out what can we do. Like the hand traps is essentially going second kind of. Yeah, we're going to make sure you get a turn by having interrupts that you can activate because you won't get to play trap cards or anything else. Your only interaction was going to be hand traps unless we fundamentally change the rules, like on cards like Infinite Impermanence and stuff like that.
Mm.
Um, but it's for Yu-Gi-Oh, it's always going to be a problem. Like if you look at games like Magic, where you have even going first in Magic is still very, very powerful because you take time to play lands, but you always get to deploy on curve before your opponent in Magic, and they've got a couple of ways of dealing with that. But the first turn advantage is, I think, from like most games, is always kind of how do you balance this? It's always a difficult question that everybody tries to answer in a slightly different way.
Mm.
I think one of the most interesting points of Yu-Gi-Oh's dilemma of this as well is um, I don't actually sometimes find going second that frustrating. I think it's natural. Going first is almost always better in anything. Chess, after thousands of years, is still technically optimal, really, to go first. Um, my issue, I think, sometimes is when that feels like almost like a doomed game. And I think one of the major frustrations I find is the turn length. And I don't know how that as a concept has ever influenced your decision making, because turn length, I think, is um, one of the most, because it's like, okay, I'm going to sit here for like up to 10 minutes. And then just for you to stand by phase, flip a card I didn't even know you had, like Maxine. It's like, okay, well, I was maybe going to attempt to deal with your field. Now you've got something like that on top of it. It's one of the most frustrating things. So yeah, basically, what is your thoughts on turn length and how do you like design around something like that?
So weird because that's part of what makes Yu-Gi-Oh unique is not having the restrictions, and you can throw down your entire strategy on turn one,
Mm.
and that makes it appealing to some players. That's the reason they love Yu-Gi-Oh, because they don't have to wait several turns to play lands to cast their cards or wait turns to evolve their Pokemon. Like Yu-Gi-Oh is like, okay, I can go all out from the very beginning. The game is on. Um, Personally, from games that I play, I really don't like 90-step combos. I think then the game becomes more of a game of memorizing all the
Mm.
interactions and going, cool, this is the steps I need to take to get to this unbreakable field, or put my opponent in this position. And waiting 10 minutes for a turn is awful. If you're the player going second and you see this and you're like, okay, can I break through this? I'm not sure. I need to see my next card before I decide to concede. And then you realize, okay, I've lost a bunch of tournament time, for example, going into games 2 and 3 by letting this all play out. So you encourage people almost to concede earlier, just so they can conserve time on the clock. And I think these it's so hard when it's one of the things that makes Yu-Gi-Oh unique and special to people is something
Mhm.
that is inherently just really bad for your game, for game design. Like it's awful to sit there and wait 10 minutes to take your turn, and then the game is already over at that point. You've just kind of watched somebody play solitaire.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I guess that it's kind of difficult. So I can't give you a straight answer. You're trying to deal with the fact that there are people that love it. The game is still growing. It sounds like things are going really well from a tournament perspective. Um, but I wouldn't encourage it. If you're making your own games at home, I would not encourage trying to recreate Yu-Gi-Oh in that sense because it's just kind of a bad you kind of have a negative playing experience when the game's being played as intended in that case.
Yeah, there certainly needs to be a sort of balancing factor or a ceiling to how long, like, you, because what you're saying is true. It is a very core part of Yu-Gi-Oh's identity, the fact that we don't have to like develop mana over a couple turns before we can do things, right? We start right away. But there definitely needs to be a limit to it because obviously it's a two-player game, so it's I feel like it's not great if one person has to wait a very long time before they even are able to take part in it, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's like I'm pretty sure there is a sweet spot to the point where people enjoy first turn comboing, also depending on what they end on, right?
Mm.
I don't think people want like I don't know, some normal summon one monster and then pass right away. Like that's not what people are asking for, I feel like, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's just a matter of, maybe toning it down a little bit to where we were maybe a couple years ago. Where
I
like if you're there's a big difference whether your opponent takes like a 3 or 4 minute first turn versus like a 10-minute first turn, right?
Yeah. I wanted to specifically ask because you mentioned a point there that I wanted to touch upon before we move on. You specifically said something about steps. My
Mhm.
personal favorite thing, I like combo decks generally, but I really love what I like to call dynamic combo decks. So it's decks that you can't really decide what to do. You sort of have to kind of like play out a couple of interactions, see what that mills, see what that hits, how your opponent interacts with you. Whereas a lot of modern deck, for a while now, are very specifically, okay, what you want to do is you want to normal summon this gets you this, then that gets you that, and then that does this, etc., etc. So
Mhm.
steps specifically when designing, is that like a do you think that's good and bad design, where you have like the spreadsheet to follow, or is something like dynamic combos a little bit more interesting, or is it worse in some ways? I don't know. I suppose if you just want to talk about that specific aspect.
Yeah, I guess from a gameplay perspective, uh, it's fun. There are players that enjoy having like this multi-step combo where it's I do this, then I do this, then I do this, and that is a part of the market that really appreciates that side of Yu-Gi-Oh. I don't particularly like it. It can be at that point. Are you really just like I like the dynamic combos like you talked about? For example, Light Sworn when you're like, okay, I'm playing Charge of the Light Brigade. If I hit a wall for my entire turn changes.
Mhm.
Something like that is kind of much more. I'm looking at the cards in front of me and trying to think of the most optimal play versus I've memorized the most optimal play. My first real problem with this was actually Infernities, when they could
Mhm.
essentially do a 90-step combo. I can't even remember what the output was, but you'd end up with like 3 Infernity barriers and a bunch of
Yep.
negates on board. And this was like before that was the norm. And I was like, okay, that is memorizing all of that is a big ask of players, especially if you get like new people. You come in and say, cool, I want to learn to play a competitive deck. It's like, okay, here is a instruction manual that has like 50 pages of exactly what you need to do um, at each step. And then it comes to like tournament testing. You're figuring out where are the break points. Like, should I ash here? Should I ash there? What's the goal? I'm not a fan of building things specifically where it's very obvious to people what you should be doing. I like giving players the tools to figure it out. I think
Mhm.
that leads to a little bit more creativity. Obviously, eventually, you will come out with the best solution. Like just the hive mind works that way. But
Mhm.
when you very heavily handedly force it, um, it doesn't feel great. At least that's from my perspective.
Mhm.
And in terms of deck building, I think this is maybe like the last point about game design, I suppose, before we maybe show some cards, Josh.
Mhm.
So the one of my bigger problems, I think, especially in recent years, it feels like a lot of the time sometimes is when there is a new deck that comes out, it's very obvious and it's very like easy these days. I feel like for a lot of these decks to just be like, okay, you play three of this, three of this, three of this. Here's three Ash, here's three Imperm, here's three, etc., etc. Maybe there's like single digit flex spots. One of my favorite thing about like something like hat format was it was a bunch of different engines jammed together. When you design an archetype, when you design decks, like what goes into the overall thinking of the end point of what that deck actually looks like? Do you have a vision for, okay, this is a three of, this is a three of, this is a three of, um, or what's like the plan there? Because I think a lot of decks in recent years sort of have built themselves, um, just by the nature of play this, play this, play this. Here's a bunch of hand traps, and I don't think creativity, in my opinion, has definitely decreased a lot over the last decade, I think.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I actually see. I kind of like thinking about it. I like the idea that you can just take three of every card in an archetype, put it into a deck, and then you start making cuts to try and make it more efficient. Because then you play with all of the cards, so you're trying to get a feel of what part of this archetype actually feels fun, what's impactful, what is effective. And starting it from deck building with that in mind, you at very least get to experience what the deck is trying to do, and then you start refining it and then going, well, this can be a one of, this can be cut. We can actually put this engine in because it does something more efficient in the combo. And you give people the tools to start from cut and paste deck into building a fully fledged deck. So I'm not opposed to that. I actually think it's ultimately very good for deck builders, or at least aspiring deck builders, to get good. Eventually, when you get to a level where you're like, you can just eyeball it and be like, that's a one of. I'm just going to play one copy of this, three copies of that, and this is the game plan. But the creativity, it does come, and it's going to be influenced by like the competitive players as well for the most part. Like I'm trying to remember in my some of the situations where that might be a little bit different from my memory. I'm trying to when the Phantom Knights came out in Japan, I don't think anybody really cared about them. It just wasn't a big deal. And then when the stateside had them, we had PK Fire, sort of became like a really, really big deck. Now, I can't remember if that's because some of the Burning Abyss cards weren't available in Japan, or if it just got completely ignored. But it was another deck where you could start with three of everything, because Dante triggers everything in your deck, and you can figure out, well, actually, which interactions make sense. Like, which ones are really powerful? Where am I getting to this? One for my Phantom Fog Blades. And you really had this opportunity to sort of like play around and figure out exactly how you want your engine to work. And the easiest place to start with that is just like just cram three of everything together and see how it goes. So I guess I'd say I don't think it's a bad thing that it goes that way. If the best deck just turns out to be you play three of everything and there's no other better cards to play, then I think that's a problem. Then I think this is a case of like, okay, you're not actually deck building at that point. You're just being told this is what you play.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree that that's a problem either. I feel like it's with the way Yu-Gi-Oh is being handled with a sort of no set rotation approach where everything from every period of the game is legal. You just have to kind of make archetypes that are contained within themselves, ideally, right? Obviously, there's examples of where they haven't done that, but usually you have to create these cards to kind of work together and not work with all other cards in the game, because otherwise you'll have a lot of problems when cards are too generic, right? And so it's always going to be this like, okay, all of these cards have the same name, they work together, so obviously they are intended to go into a deck together. So all that's left for the community is to figure out like how many of each individual cards do I play? Maybe some of them are not worth playing at all, right? You'll take a look at all of the cards and decide, okay, this one's a 3 of because it's really good. This one's a 1 of because I only want to occasionally access it. This one's not good enough to play at all. And then how much space does that leave me with? Is this 30 cards that I've now decided on playing? Is this 20? How do I fill up these remaining slots? Do I need like a secondary engine? Or do I need consistency cards? Do I spend all this room on non-engine because my deck's very like a one card combo deck or whatever, right? I feel like that's just the nature of the game, and I don't necessarily think that has been super different. Like I'm thinking of obviously in very early Yu-Gi-Oh days when decks were like good stuff decks and we didn't really have archetypes yet. That's where it was more like freestyle deck building. But I think as soon as we got like archetypes, right? I'm thinking like Gladiator Beasts, Light Sworns are very early examples where you did exactly that. Like you just looked at all the Glad Beast cards, you put them all in the deck. You're like, okay, this one's a one of because I can summon it from the deck whenever I want. This one's a three of because it's bigger than the other one, so I really want it. I'm playing the War Chariot. How much space does that leave me with? I'll throw in some extra trap cards, and that's your Glad Beast deck from 2008, right? It's just,
yeah.
yeah.
No, I can see that. And yeah, it's just I guess that's just kind of Yu-Gi-Oh in a nutshell,
Yeah.
really. With
I
deck
do
building.
see how like hat format is an outlier in that sense though, right? Because it is quite cool to see after years of having archetypes in the game how like in hat format there's like decks that completely bypass that rule by just playing like a bunch of good stuff cards again, right? Something that we hadn't had for a long time before that, right? Like I can't remember before 20 like I don't know in 2014 hat is like the one deck that just throws a bunch of good stuff engines together. Before that I think it's a long time since we've had that happen. Maybe like chaos decks in like 2011 or something, or the plant deck in 2011. But like for the most part, it's been archetypes, right?
Yeah, I mean that's from a balance perspective. It's the easiest is if everything's tied to archetypes, and you can just
Hmm.
stop supporting that archetype once
Yeah.
it becomes too powerful. And like you got cards like Machine Duplication, Snake Rain, which are just a little bit too open, and someday they're going to be a problem.
Hmm.
If you try and release a new theme that can use these cards, you essentially have Painful Choice available, or Machine Dupe on Spiral Quick Fix or something like that, which
Yeah.
ended up becoming extraordinarily powerful. So the more open you design things in a
Hmm.
game like Yu-Gi-Oh, which has this eternal format, the more problems that it's going to cause. So you end up restricting design space.
Yeah.
The more generic you go, you just at some point you end up having to adjust the Forbidden Unlimited list to compensate for how many decks can play these generic cards and what you're doing with them.
Hmm.
And the very easiest way is just say everything works within this archetype. If you do this, you can only summon a clang monster for the rest of the turn, or
Hmm.
something like that. Then it kind of makes it very easy to
Did you
control
say Clang?
the power output.
Yeah.
Clang, yeah, just
Clang.
I don't know, it's just a good.
I'm in my head. I have this image of Beaky like shouting at you, telling you to ban machine duplication for like 10 years.
I mean, it was deserved. That card was absolutely nuts. In fact, the last regional I ever played in it was Darkcom Dragon, not returned from different dimension. It was Dimension Fusion.
Hmm.
And the spin on the version of deck I was playing was Machine Duplication on Cyber Valley.
Yeah.
So essentially, you just draw like a bunch of cards. You could play them with Mind Control, grab the opponent's stuff. Machine Duplication, Troop, Dupe, and Scoop. It was always going to be a problem at some point. Like all you just needed was one viable machine, and
Hmm.
a card like that becomes like a huge problem. But they're also the exciting cards. They're the cards that kind of like make people want to try experimenting with
Yeah.
Yu-Gi-Oh. So it's that challenge of like what's fun versus like what's actually going to cause a problem. Like several years later, when you're sat around a table and you're talking about different archetypes or like what we're going to do, and it's like,
Hmm.
oh, what about this? It's like, well, you're gonna have to give that like an extra 100 attack points, otherwise it works with this card that then
Yeah.
ends up
Yeah.
being ridiculous.
I think this is a great segue to like talking about some individual cards we prepared beforehand.
Okay,
But I wanted to
really quick,
start with.
I did want to bring
Mhm.
up this one last question before we do
Okay.
this. So this was, I think this is very specifically like around about your time, because we have something very similar going on right now. I'm just curious, like, how did you feel about like Orcust, where everyone was just playing a small Orcust engine where you just go like any two monsters you get hand trapped, link them together, make mermaid, and then that does an extra thing for your deck? Because we are in somewhat of a similar situation right now. Like, what were
Mhm.
your thoughts on that?
Uh, I guess it depends on sort of like how impactful. If you're not viable, if you don't play this, then that's a problem. If it's
Hmm.
an efficient way that you can slot it into your deck and it kind of synergizes with what you're already trying to do, or it gives you another axis to move your deck, I think that's fine. But if you end up in a situation where it's like, if you don't play this engine, you can't play competitively, I think that is a problem. And it ultimately is going to result in people probably even buying less cards unless you power creep that engine. Like you end up having to print something better than that engine or a direct counter to it. So it's okay. I think it's okay to kind of have these mini engines that you kind of slot into decks that give you some more stuff to do. But I wouldn't necessarily feel. I don't like it when you're just like, okay, I have to play this particular engine. Like my deck build starts with these cards in it. I don't
Mhm.
particularly like that.
Is that something that you also thought in like historic ways of some like because what that makes me think of is like something like 2012. I don't even know if you were already working on the game at that point, but probably, right? Um,
I joined 2011, I think.
okay,
Order of
so
Chaos
because that
was
what you just said is like in 2011, if I was building my competitive deck, I feel like 90% of them started with like 3 tour guides,
Hell yeah!
which
Sorry.
also
yeah.
was a expensive card at the time. So is that something that even at the time you felt like was maybe a problematic thing?
Tour guide Sangan number 17, I think, was problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And the rulings got changed on that, which made it less impactful. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, tour guide was at that stage way too strong for what
Mm-hmm.
it allowed you to do. And the problem was, I think the card was available as a secret rare, and
Yes,
I can't
it
remember if
looks
it had
like
an
it.
ulti rare print from a
That's way
from a set
later
that was
though.
like
That is way later. So the
Yeah, and
timeline for Tour Guide is it came out as a secret rare, and then its first reprint was, I believe, a rare in one of the battle packs.
Battle Pack 1.
Yes.
Yeah, I
That's what made
remember
it
Tour Guide being in
accessible,
it.
I think.
It was in Star
Yeah, I
Pack
think
as
it was.
well at some point.
Or was
Yeah,
it?
the Starfoil Tour Guide was
Oh, right. Yeah,
super
that's the thing. Yeah.
expensive. But that was Battle Pack 1. Um, Tour Guide was so weird because I think it was just like placed in the wrong set. Um,
Mhm.
I think that was before I joined, but it was in Extreme
Victory. Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
I
Extreme.
don't extreme other adjective. But it was basically a card that was so perfect for the introduction of the XE mechanic.
Mhm.
And it ended up being printed in a set that was still kind of focusing on the synchro era. So I think Torgo would have probably been better if, in fact, that would have been printed in Generation Force as one of the World Premiere cards.
Mhm.
I think it was a World Premiere card tour guide initially
Yep.
when it came out.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, a card that was so rare like that, it was like one of those things that kind of like if you were a secondary market vendor and you just had like a stack of tour guides, you were laughing when that came out because just like it just skyrocketed in value, and it was I think that kind of stuff made it really hard on the players. If you want to be competitive, tour guide into Sangan into number 17, detach, search for something was just so extraordinarily powerful. I don't think there was much else that was competing with that around that
Mhm.
time. But forgive me, I might be remembering a bit long. It was a long time ago.
Yeah.
All right. Shall we get some cards out?
Yeah,
Yes,
go for
and
it.
the one
Let's
I
do it.
wanted to start with is the one that was kind of the whole reason why we're doing this is the one that you messaged me about because it was on the video that you did with MBT.
Yes.
And the reason why I wanted to bring it up, and the card I'm talking about is Transaction Rollback. Of course, I don't think I
Yeah.
need to show it to you because you've already seen it. Um, and so just maybe put into words your initial reaction in like briefly that you had about the card, and then maybe I'll say what I said in response to it.
Yeah, sure. So when I read through the card, it's basically understanding that you skip the cost.
Yes.
I thought it was the requirements to activate the card, but somebody apparently said that that's not how it works. But
Yep.
you could just effectively activate any trap card in your graveyard, ignoring any of the setup or anything like that. And just when you read that, it's kind of like a lot of these
Mhm.
requirements that were put on trap cards were specifically to make them hard to activate, and you just bypass that. And it's just something that forever, when you print like a trap card in the future, a normal trap, it's like rollback is always going to be an option
Mhm.
for using this. It also felt like well, a lot of people focus on like the combo and the FTK potential of the card. It felt like this just seems like really good with generic trap cards. Like
Mhm.
I think there was the Dharma Cannon, which is like a Book of Moon and stuff like that. Just being able to do that from your graveyard felt really strong. So it felt generically strong and
Mhm.
future very problematic.
Mhm.
I believe your argument was, well, then just don't print problematic trap cards.
Okay. Well, no, that was part of it, but I
Yeah,
just wanted to say that from a game designer or card designer perspective, my initial reaction, I'm pretty sure when the card was first released was exactly the same, right? Like the
yeah,
first thing that happened when that card was announced, I was like, okay, that's a terrible idea, and everyone went looking for the craziest ways how you can like abuse this card and which kind of cards you can copy and so on and so forth. Everyone was scared, and then the card came out, and it turns out, or at least I think it's important to evaluate a card not only in theory but also in the context of the time when it comes out, because I'm convinced that if this card had come out in like let's say 2017 paleo times, we would not be talking about that format as Zodiac format. Like that would have been paleo format, right? If you could have
for
like
sure.
played this card in your grass paleo deck from 2017, like that deck would have been the most powerful deck in the format. Well, it arguably already was, but you know what I mean. So like
Had
How
to
many
put that
tubs did
last
you
bit
have
in.
in that format?
no, but so my argument is after having played with the card is like there are already plenty of completely degenerate things you can copy with transaction rollback in the game. It's not something that limits future design space because we already have trap cards with super hard to pay costs that, for example, lock your opponent out of special summoning from the extra deck or special summoning entirely for the entire turn, right?
Yeah,
So the things that you could potentially abuse rollback with are already out there, and people are not doing that. Even at a competitive level, there is no deck at the moment that is doing anything of that sorts with transaction rollback. Because even the decks that could set this up, right, any 2 trap cards from your deck to the graveyard is not an easy task to set up. But something like Beatrice, which can send 2 cards from like one on your turn, one on your opponent's turn, turns out people are using Beatrice at the moment, but they're not even using transaction rollback because there's just better things you can do. There's more impactful things you can do that doesn't require you to play 2 completely basically bricks in your deck that you have to access that way, or otherwise they don't do anything, right? Um,
Okay.
so I believe it's one of those examples where it looks very scary in theory, but in practice it has just turned out okay in the context of 2024 Yu-Gi-Oh, right?
So I guess my counterpoint to that would
Mm-hmm.
be, and that's perfectly valid. Like I think if Yu-Gi-Oh used rotation, I'd have probably had
Mm-hmm.
less of a visceral reaction to
Mm-hmm.
rollback because it'd be like, okay, in this format we can just be super careful what we print. But it's
Mm-hmm.
more of a case of, as we talked a little bit about that power creep that's just kind of always constantly in the background, is that
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be better trap cards printed at some point, and then this card's always in the back of your mind of like,
Mm-hmm.
this has an interaction it can do. Um, and then you've got the thing that currently Beatrice is kind of clunky to get it going, but if you suddenly start getting like a heavy mill theme or something like that, that can make it
Mm-hmm.
much easier to get it to set the situations up.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a problem later. I mean, I'm still surprised that that card isn't played a lot more, but I guess I've just not been playing enough at this stage
I
to
play
see
it
this.
in Paleo, but it's not a meta deck, let me tell you that.
That's unfortunate. I like the Paleo deck, to be fair.
I do too.
But it's yeah, it's just a case of like it's one of those things that you just have to keep in your mind
Mhm.
forever when
Yeah.
designing new cards.
Yeah.
It's without any kind of restriction. It's not even like if
Yeah.
your graveyard contains 3 or more trap cards, use it. It's
Mhm.
just it's always going to be there, sitting in the background.
Mhm.
Eventually, when something shows up,
Yeah.
unless you just stop printing any good trap card that
Yeah.
it can work on. In which case, you're limiting your future design because you're scared of something you made in the past, which then
Mhm.
affects your ability to make products that people are going to care about in the future.
Yeah, and
Um,
I do agree with that, and I think something you said makes a lot of sense to me, which is that I don't think this limits trap card design, but it does limit setup design, right? Like, because what you said is like if you make another archetype that maybe has a super easy way to set up more traps in the graveyard, then suddenly that's what it's lacking. I feel like it's not lacking the great targets because it has those. It's lacking like decks that can easily set it up and afford to play it, right? There's not many
yeah,
decks that have a lot of good trap cards and easy ways to get it into the graveyard, right? It's like basically Paleo and Labyrinth, which are both not really meta strategies on their own, and transaction rollback is like solid in them, but it doesn't make them meta strategies. So something that enables it more would make it potentially problematic in the future. However, the way I think about this is like I feel like making a card that's cool now, potentially problematic in the future, is something that if you handled it correctly, and that's a big if, is not
yeah,
that big of a deal because we've had a lot of those cards historically that were completely fine when they came out, but then aged very poorly and just weren't tackled in a timely manner. I'm looking at cards like my favorite examples for these are like cards like Maxi, which I believe in 2011 were completely fine to be printed. Um, because for years, Maxi was a card that was being played, but not being too oppressive because decks weren't made to special summon 20 times in one turn and didn't have a plan B, right?
yeah,
Whereas like nowadays, that's what decks do, right? They special summon a lot, and if they can't do that, then they basically don't really have a game plan, right? And so a card that has come out in 2011 and was fine has aged very poorly. Another one is Anti-Spell, is another great example of a card that existed since 2003, never was a problem until they made pendulums, and all of a sudden, problem. And I wonder if you think those cards were poorly designed to begin with, or whether they should have just recognized that they aged poorly and gotten rid of them like sooner or something.
I guess in the sense that you can kind of spot which things are going to age poorly,
Hmm.
and you kind of want to avoid doing that. And things like Matsi, the kill potential in Yu-Gi-Oh is just so high, and it has been for a very long time. Where if I get one turn, I can kill you
Hmm.
very consistently,
Yeah.
um, and stuff like that. That card was always had the potential to age poorly,
Yeah.
and that's when you kind of want to start thinking like maybe we want to add some restrictions to this,
Hmm.
or it's not. perhaps 100% okay to print, or maybe it should be limit the number of times you get to draw, or something like that.
Okay.
Just leaving it very open-ended is you just create the opportunity for a problem later.
Mhm.
And it can be difficult because, again, like anti-spell fragrance, like pendulums were not even consideration. There was no indication
Yeah.
that the game would even last as long as it did for
Mhm.
pendulums to come out. And then when pendulums did, somebody goes through their box of commons and says, "Oh, how does anti-spell interact with this?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, it turns out it completely shuts that down." And the more you try and future proof, and it is always that challenge of like, and I think you said something that I liked on your stream, which is like, where you're trying to make fun stuff. Like you want it to be fun, but then if you limit yourself too much, it just ends up being like
Yeah.
generic garbage. It doesn't do anything, and it's that balance. But I think trying to future proof stuff in the future, if you're just like, okay, drawing 3 cards with no drawback is always going to be extraordinarily powerful. Maybe
Mhm.
don't print it or add some restrictions.
Yep.
Um, I think cards like Cards of Demise didn't age particularly well either. I don't know if that card's even still legal. You like to play Card
At
of Demise?
one.
It's at 1
Is
now.
it
Yeah.
one? Yeah,
Mm.
it's like cards like that would just like felt a little bit like pushing the envelope when they were printing. So it's like, okay, this feels really,
It's
very strong.
Floodgate's fault. Don't
Floodgate's
ask
fault,
me.
yeah.
Speaking of which, I have a
Ryan
card for
Lewis.
you here,
Sure.
which I think you will probably be aware of. Put it
Mhm.
in the group chat if you haven't read it yet,
Oh,
but
yeah, yeah. Sure.
True King of all Calamities.
Oh god, this card. Yes, I remember this card. This card is so much fun.
So I think it brings up a lot of questions about the extra deck and its accessibility and its genericness, as well as a second portion, which is just how restrictive and powerful it is, and i.e., a floodgate. Maybe just walk us through this on the design level of where you're at with it.
Yeah. This is another thing that makes Yu-Gi-Oh really, really unique, is the extra deck is a set of tools that you never have to draw, which pretty much every other card game is based around you need to find the tools in your deck and access them. And this is incredibly dangerous because like it's always going to be a part of the game, but it's also what kind of allows you to build into certain strategies and fun. I do not like having something this oppressive where you don't need to draw it. Like it's always available to you. If you've just got you hit your
Mhm.
combo, like you've got access to it. It's not like you even had to draw this card and then go through some hoops to get it up. But I remember playing against this on like Master Duel, and it was really frustrating every time this came up. So I think
Damn,
it was
crazy.
banned in the TCG and banned in
Really?
the OCG, but it was legal in Master Duel. And just like every time
Yeah.
you see it, you're like,
Yeah.
all right, you got me. But stuff like this, it's weird that the cards that players love in Yu-Gi-Oh, or at least the cards that players understand are immediately very powerful, are cards that says your opponent can't do things.
Yeah.
Um, and it makes it very easy to make this like, oh great, yeah, we print this, we can make it a secret rare. It's going to really push whatever product you put it in because it's so format warping, and like everybody's going to want a copy of this.
See,
But
it's
at the same
funny you
time, it's
say
like,
that about VFD because it wasn't even that. It was just a super rare.
yeah, exactly. I think
Yeah.
missed opportunity maybe.
Yeah.
But this card is just it's the fact that you don't anything that you don't need to draw should be a lot more controlled
Yeah.
in terms of how oppressive it is on the opponent. Like
Yeah.
I kind of like that you can play your spot removal in
Yeah.
the extra deck.
Hmm.
I don't think your floodgates should be accessible from the extra deck, but
Yeah,
that's just a personal opinion.
that is a great point about the extra deck. I think it is one thing that sets Yu-Gi-Oh apart from other card games. The fact that you have this kind of toolbox that is excluded from the randomness of card games, right? I think is an exceptional tool that makes the game very, very interesting and makes a lot of situations solvable that otherwise you wouldn't be able to solve because you don't have that toolbox in other games. But obviously, it is something that is a very dangerous concept in a game that is otherwise based on, like, a card game is in parts should be based on like variance and luck, and that's how games feel different, right? If you make too powerful of tools for the extra deck that you can access every single game in like this step-by-step combo, right? That's when then where you need to be careful, right? And yeah, I don't know how many times we have to learn this lesson in this game, but I feel like we're in the process. We're on step like 300 of learning this lesson, but we'll get there.
Why do
Yeah,
floodgates exist? Like, what is the purpose? Like, because I can't see the logic from a game design perspective as to why a floodgate exists.
Hmm.
Just a no cost flip this up
uh,
and your opponent cannot play. Like, what is? Why?
I personally I don't like them. I like it if it makes it harder for your opponent to play, but I don't like things that hard shut people down. There
Do you have
are
an example? Sorry, do you have an example of like a floodgate that is okay in your opinion? Something that's balanced in such a way?
I'm trying to think of an example of a floodgate that I
Struggling
don't
there.
mind, but yeah.
No, I genuinely, I
Uh,
am curious. I genuinely am curious where we draw the line, right? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
yeah, I guess if I said one that I think is on the line of being okay, maybe Imperial Iron Wall, which is like players can't
Mhm.
banish cards from their graveyard because
Yeah.
it interferes with certain strategies, but it doesn't stop me playing my cards. Like it's not
Mhm.
like Imperial Order, which is just like, oh yeah, all of your green cards are blanked. Oh,
Okay.
okay, great.
Yeah.
It's something that you can still kind of maneuver around, as opposed to you just looking at your hand going, I can't play the game at all. Like it's one thing if your strategy gets caught out by a floodgate, but if it's like
Mhm.
just generally really generic and powerful, like Macrocosmos or something like that, and it's just like,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm just obliterated by this. It's
Yeah.
just it's not fun, but it's part of that symptom of like, oh, how do you slow the game down? And I think floodgates is probably the wrong way to do it. There are cards that are
Mhm.
very easy to get people excited about when you're like, oh yeah, this is great. Like you have temporary ones. Like I think Dimensional Barrier, when that was originally released into the format, it was just such a ridiculous trap card. It probably shouldn't have been printed.
Mhm.
Um, it's just like, yeah, you can't Xe summon, fusion summon, or whatever. You just activate it and it blanks that part. Like
Mhm.
stuff like that is very easy to get, very easy to push, but not very fun to play against. So
Mhm.
I'd like things where it's like if you want to, I don't know, picking a floodgate, it's like if you want to do something, you've got to pay an alternative cost or something like that, which makes it more painful to do the things as opposed
Mhm.
to necessarily 100% saying you can't play like Imperial Order again. You can't play
Yeah.
spell cards. It'd be like, oh, if you want to play a spell card, you've got to pay extra cost or something.
Yeah.
That would I'd be a little bit better with, but yeah,
Yeah.
floodgates are not fun, and I would say that you probably shouldn't be making more of them at this stage. I think you kind of got enough.
Yeah. Here's the paradox thing where like a fair floodgate, I feel like something like Imperial Iron Wall, right? To take your example, is something that cannot really exist within Yu-Gi-Oh because people just won't play the card if it doesn't completely kill the opponent's deck, right? As a matter of fact, people will not play Imperial Iron Wall, and if they play it, they will put it in their side deck because there is a deck in the format that'll completely get shut down by it, right? Like people will not play these cards. People refuse to play those cards, right? If you're making a floodgate, it needs to actually like either be generic enough to be main deck, like skill drain or something, or it needs to be so good against specific decks that you can put it into your side deck. It's like this weird thing where the Yu-Gi-Oh community screams out against floodgates, but they will only use the most unfair and toxic ones, right?
I
I mean,
mean,
come on,
yeah,
Josh.
that's
That's unfair, right? Like you criticize society, but you'd
No,
partake in
I'm
it,
not
kind of thing.
criticizing it. It's just that's a very
Yeah,
natural
yeah.
thing. It makes
Like,
sense. Like it's you should not be playing Iron Wall, right? It's not a
yeah.
good card because it is too fair. I'm
But
just
it.
saying, like
yeah.
design wise,
Mhm.
like it's weird. It's paradox because you're either making you have to make a floodgate that completely shuts the opponent down if you want to create such a card. So it almost feels like someone out there makes all these cards knowing very well that they are going to completely shut down the opponent out of the game because they want that to happen because otherwise they won't see play, right?
And I think the most
And
egregious problem is you mentioned the side deck, right? Because you just bring
Mhm.
that in. Yu-Gi-Oh is very short in
Yeah.
its turn span or its game length.
Yeah.
If you draw that going first in your side deck, it doesn't matter how niche it is. Like even
Mhm.
Iron Wall, if you're playing
Yeah.
against something that is specifically designed around that, like Metaphys or Ritual Beast or something, right? It's like, well, a lot of those decks are just going to be completely unable to play the game, right?
Yeah.
and now you're running into the differences between game design and product design because you
Mm.
can make fair cards that nobody plays and then nobody buys them. So
Mm.
you end up
Sad.
having but the business side of things starts pushing into your game design. And it's that kind of weird thing where you became a game designer to make experiences that people enjoy, but you only get to be a game designer because somebody pays you to do it.
Mm.
Like, so you kind of have to balance both sides of that equation, and it's tough.
Yeah.
Um, and like you said, like a fair floodgate, no one's going to play. It's
Yeah.
it's too fair. It's actually I can't remember which event. I think it was Leipzig YCS. I was actually at a bar and Patrick Holborn was there, and we were talking about some stuff. And the object of how like being too fair was sort of a topic that came up in a conversation. It's like I'm not going to play something that's fair.
Hmm.
Like I'm here to win, and I'm like,
Yeah.
it makes sense. Like
Yeah.
it's just how the game runs,
Yeah.
for better or worse.
Hmm.
I'm just thinking of the domino effect of 2012 bar conversation between Matt and Patrick Hoban.
It sounded
Bean
like
Smith 2024.
it sounded like the start to one of those insane jokes where it's like Matt Bell and Patrick Hoban walk into a bar in 2012. What happens next?
And everything came out as a secret rare. It's probably the punchline to that joke.
Vanity's emptiness printed 2 years later. Coincidence? I think not.
Ooh, Vanity's Emptiness. God, I remember that one as well. That was kind of like a card that when it came out,
It was
just
terrible.
got kind of ignored until,
Yeah.
what was it, Dino Rabbit format, and it just got discovered.
It was Dragon Ruler. It was popularized,
Yeah,
right?
it really took off during Dragon Ruler. Yeah, I think it came out in like 2011 already, and then it really took off in 2013.
Yeah, another example of a card that's just really, really unfair and unfun to play against.
It's
And it
confusing
creates
to
this.
me because sometimes they add sentences to these kind of cards to kind of it almost seems like they are aware that these cards can be problematic, like how on Emptiness they added a clause that makes it easier to out because when a card is sent to the graveyard it destroys itself, right? And you're like, okay, well, that does give my opponent at least some chance to maybe deal with that card if they don't have a specific answer to a spell trap. Maybe they can run over one of my smaller monsters and that outs my Floodgate as well, right? But then that card was made in 2011, and then there's countless of other examples of cards made after that where they just didn't include a clause like that, where those were just continuous trap cards, period, right? There was no no condition
Yeah,
attached or no additional way to out it or something, right? Which almost makes it seem like we're going backwards on these kind of things that we've learned about floodgates, right?
yeah, and again, it comes down to pushing the envelope.
Mhm.
Again, whereas it's like we're intentionally making something that
Yeah.
people are not going to be able to ignore, or they're going to get excited about.
Mhm.
Um, and it just so happens that floodgating feels really miserable as a player to be playing against. But it happens on every card. It's like even the hand traps. You look at the quality of them and stuff like that. You know, so they just slowly get more and more pushed
Mhm.
in what they can do or what their specific focus is on how relevant it is. Um, and it's a problem with the power creep that we were discussing earlier. That it's always going to be there in a game. Like in fact, if they announce rotation, I I wonder how many people would show up to rotation YCSs. I guess people love events; they'd still go. But if Konami turned around and said we were going to do rotation, you could probably poll the chat and say, would you carry on playing? I mean, one of
It,
the things that people really love
yeah.
about Yu-Gi-Oh is that cards from 2011 can suddenly spike in value,
Yeah.
and they can become pretty relevant to meta play. There
Yeah.
you go. I saw Peeps Yu-Gi-Oh 100% would quit if you. I mean, not to call you out, Peeps Yu-Gi-Oh, but like it's just again, it's like that kind of like that
Fucking peeps.
that business side of things is like, okay, well then if you're not doing this,
Yeah.
where do you do it? Do you introduce a new mechanic or do you start pushing the cards a little bit more?
Yeah. I
Pushing the
think
cards is easier.
I think at the moment the ban list is a little bit of an underused tool. I feel like it's something that is because we don't have rotation, it almost feels like we have two tools, or Konami has two tools. The one is power creep, like new card design, and the other one is the forbidden and limited list. And to me, at least, it feels like something that should be used a little more aggressively, but that's maybe not being used
I
for
have a
like
specific
obviously
question on this from the
business reasons.
Patreon question. We can ask once we get to that point, I think,
Okay.
because I wanted to save that part specifically.
Okay, my bad.
You're bad. Did you want to move on to another card, Josh, or?
See, I had prepared like two cards that, like I said in the chat we had beforehand, where I wanted you to guess whether I thought that card was good or bad design. One of those you've actually already mentioned, so I know you are familiar with it. But I guess let's start off with
Yeah.
that one, and that is Destructive Daruma Karma Cannon. So I assume you are familiar with it, but I can still
Yeah, it came up on MBT stream because
Oh, then it was
he
not
asked
in the
me
video,
to.
was it?
No, it was on the live stream. It wasn't in the video on
Okay. I
YouTube.
only I
But
only saw the video. Okay. Well,
Bro's just listing his paleo deck.
that's the plan.
Just
I
live
just
in the
want to
card
hear him
market, start
call
picking
any
these up.
paleo card a well-designed card, and then I'm happy. But yeah, no, I've linked you the card if you need to take a look at the effect again. But I just wanted to
Yeah.
talk to you about maybe the design of this card, which maybe we can talk about the design of trap cards in general in Yu-Gi-Oh! And why they play such a small role in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And whether you like that or not. But maybe just because I didn't watch the entire stream segment on MBT stream, maybe talk to me about what you thought about Karma Cannon, even
You
just
also
briefly.
This is
know,
a
do you also know, sorry, just to clarify, do you also know specifically like its interactions other than just Book of Mooning and how it works with Link monsters, right?
yeah, it kills link monsters, and it's a
And boss
Book of
monsters that
Total
are,
Eclipse.
yeah, it's Book of Eclipse, and it's also specifically just removes Link monsters. But another point that I think maybe you haven't seen in your time as an interaction is it removes boss monsters. So monsters that say are unaffected, it basically just makes the player send it.
Oh, it's the player making the action. It doesn't affect the monster. Oh, that
Yes,
makes it a lot better.
yes. Like a monster that can't be flipped face down by it because it's unaffected will be sent to the graveyard because it makes the opponent perform the action.
Yu-Gi-Oh is so complicated. Um, yeah, this card is. I really like this. I think it's where trap cards should be. In terms of power level, like it's very
Yeah.
impactful if this goes off.
Yeah.
You don't immediately throw it in every deck.
Yeah.
And it gives the players chance to essentially what I was saying on MBT stream about is it gives the players a chance to actually think about where and when you should play this,
Yeah.
which is the hallmark of a great card design, where you can have a conversation about where it fits, or if you're making a cut for it, and you could argue both of the answers are technically yes, depending on the context.
Mhm.
This is an idea. This is what I'd call like great design, and I like it with rollback as well, when you could just potentially have this lined up in the graveyard later in the game and just be like, oh yeah, cool, I'm not dead this turn because I can just
Yeah.
trigger this off again.
Yeah.
I would say that you probably really like this trap card.
Yeah, I do.
Because of
I mean,
that.
that was not the
Yeah.
hardest one to guess, to be fair.
No,
No, I
fair.
love
I
this
mean,
card.
it's
It's one of my favorite cards to play with out of recent years. One of my favorite designs because I feel like it does something very unique, which is make a trap card that actually sees meta play without making it a floodgate, which is typically currently like the only two kinds of trap cards that are seeing play is like one of traps that some archetypes can search in their first turn combos. They'll be like, add one sword soul card from your deck to your hand, and they add like their sword soul Icarus attack, quote unquote, you
Yeah.
know. And then the other one, chat, I'm not counting Imperm and Evenly. Those are not really trap cards. But yeah.
A spell
And the
card.
other thing is like floodgates or stuff that like Solemn Judgment that people side
Mm.
specifically for going first. They don't actually include them in their main deck usually. They'll like side deck some really oppressive trap cards for going first. And like the only trap card that works in a different way is Karma Cannon, because it's one of the few trap cards that actually is good at breaking boards, right? You can set it when you go
Yeah.
second, and it does deal with your opponent's entire board. It doesn't work in every format, but it's like something that more trap cards should be like, I feel like.
No, I agree with that. Trap cards should be impactful. And
Mhm.
back in the day, long time ago, getting Mirror Force flipped on you was disgusting. And people would be maxing out on their spell and trap removal,
Yeah.
which pushed traps further back. But it was impactful, so it was kind of exciting to keep it in mind. And a lot of trap cards these days are kind of like they're so slow and they're just not impactful enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is something that kind of flips out on its head because it will end your turn if you play into it
Yeah.
incorrectly.
And it's confusing to me because I feel like they are so not scared of power creeping spells and monsters, where it feels like they're almost way too scared on doing it with normal trap cards. Like we're getting more powerful spell cards almost every set. Like we're getting powerful even staples that go into a lot of different decks, right? We're getting new
Action out
pod cards
monsters, everything.
regularly,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. We're getting so many more like different versions of this and that in every single set, utility spell cards, monsters, and all that kind of stuff. But trap cards, it just feels like whenever you're reading a generic trap in recent years, it's almost always underpowered. They're never really going out there and trying something that ends up being good, right? It's always just super scared, locked behind like ridiculous requirements or costs or conditions, and never really works out, right?
That's that kind of weird thing again, where trap cards, the ideal situation, you go first and you set them, and you get to use them. If you go second, you have to get through your opponent's board without having access to one card you can activate
Yeah,
immediately.
exactly. Yeah.
And it just kind of means that traps two, because of how much everything else is sped up, like what you have to do to trap cards to make them like really viable, things like evenly matched, which is, oh, I can just activate this from my hand. Like
Yeah.
that's absurd. It's because it's no longer a trap card in that sense. I
It's
mean, it
it's
is a
hardly
trap card,
it
but
doesn't even count as a trap card because going first, it actually like it's never something that traps your opponent, right? You know, you're never setting
yeah,
evenly and then catching your opponent off guard. It's exclusively for going second. It's like the opposite of a trap card.
exactly. And things like infinite impermanence, which are really, I like impermanence, but again, it's that thing where it's like you have to be. The reason that it's so viable is because you can play it not as a
Yeah.
trap card.
Yeah.
And the designs for that, it goes away from what trap cards were
Mhm.
supposed to be in the
Yeah.
game. And I guess you're just trying to find a way to scale it with the modern version of the game. I don't really know if there's any other big trap cards that are being played or the situation, but you always have like the one turn
Very.
delay on trap cards, and that's
Mhm.
always been their biggest problem.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a bad thing or a good thing where the color of evenly matched is essentially completely irrelevant, right? Like that could just read as a spell, that could read as a monster, like it's because it doesn't functionally play like a trap card, so
I think it's kind of it's I care because like the trap cards are a part of the fundamental identity of what makes up Yu-Gi-Oh! And when you
Mhm.
see something like that sort of falling by the wayside, it's kind of sad because it was such a big part of the original game, and some of the biggest plot twists in the anime and stuff was
yeah. You
the
activated my trap
trap card
cards
coming
thing.
down.
Yeah.
Exactly, and that kind of stuff's important. And when that no longer becomes part of the game, or rather, it's just not viable. That's sad. And I don't like seeing personally. I don't like seeing trap cards that work extremely differently. I like it when they do interesting things, but I don't necessarily like it when you're almost kind of saying like, oh, this is a spell card, but we're going to print it purple and make it
Mm.
function differently. Because it kind of, and then when you try and teach a new player how to play, and you're like, this is how trap cards work. And then
Mm.
they play something against you and you go, infinite impermanence. So like, well, you can't. You're like, well, actually, I can, because this trap card is completely different from every last 5 minutes teaching you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. It seems about right.
I actually like this when something is like incredibly. I find it creative to make use of cards in different ways. I also really like it when they make pendulum archetypes that make use of this pendulum mechanic in a very different way,
Yeah.
rather than your classic setup scales pendulum 5 and just combo from there. Right? They make like pendulum archetypes that play very well with the idea of having these kind of spell cards or something in your extra deck that has an impact, right? There's some archetypes that I feel like are really cool when they kind of twist the rules of a certain mechanic. Um, so I don't hate the design on something like Evenly or Impermanence. I actually think that's cool. I do agree. I completely agree with the other part of like having the normal concept of a trap card completely fall off of the face of the earth is something that I'm personally sad about. I like the interaction that trap cards provide to Yu-Gi-Oh! When they're not just floodgates or something that stops your opponent from playing completely.
Yeah, the
Yeah. And so,
identity.
Yeah.
Hello, Farfa here in post. Apologies for the technical difficulty that we had here. It was basically 10 minutes of nothing, so I've gone and edited that out. The whole point of the Zodiac thing kind of moved on, and so we decided to show him some modern cards that I suppose he wasn't really a part of the design process, and that's where the rest of the podcast continues. Enjoy. Also, subscribe to our Patreon. It's just $1. All right, show him the card, Josh.
which card are we looking at?
Yes, there was one other card I wanted to show you. Pop, pop, pop. I gotta Google these. I only wrote down the names. There you go. I wonder if you can spot what's cool or wrong with this one. So this one, if
World
you have not seen
Sea,
it before, maybe read it out to us and tell us what
World
you
Sea
think.
Dragons Atlantis.
Yes.
1+ effect monster, link for 2500 attack. You can control one of this card. You can only use each of the following effects of this card once per turn during your main phase. Banish all monsters on the field. Then special summon as many monsters that were special summon. Face up or face down defense turn. The battle phase quick effect. You can destroy as many cards on the field up to the number of co-link monsters on the field. This seems good.
It is good. Yeah, that's not a
This
spoiler.
It's a
seems
good
this
card.
seems this seems very good. One of the things I'm worried about is it special summons the monsters back, so it's going to
Mhm.
trigger them all again, right?
Potentially.
If you have anything that's not like hard once per turn and you summon it back, then you can use it again. Yeah.
And it's just 1+ effect monster, so you can turn any of your link fours just straight into this.
Yep.
Yep.
Um, And you've got the quick effect, destroy cards on the field, as a quick nuke. This this first effect really worries me, actually, looking at this, which is just banish everything, special summon everything back. That feels like the thing that's most likely to get abused.
You can also choose the position as well. You can bring everything back and face down, or
Yeah.
and then
Oh, face up or face down. Okay.
yeah, and you can like choose the zones as well. You can position them where you feel you want to put them, etc.
Do you don't control all monsters on the field? You don't control how your opponent's monsters come back, do you? Or do you actually get
You
to
do.
choose your
do.
opponent's battle positions?
Yes,
And like...
you do.
Oh, okay. And I guess the design behind this was the idea is that you could banish everything, then bring everything back perfectly co-linked, and then nuke the opponent's field. That was
That's the
probably where they
idea.
were going with this. I'm gonna imagine that's not how it gets played so much, and it's more about, oh, I can just re-trigger any of my non-once per turn effects.
Ironically enough,
this-
so the way it has mostly been used up until now is actually for the easy ability to OTK with going into battle phase,
That's the
co-linking.
funny thing, because when this card came out, everyone thought that's what it was. The way to abuse it is like non-once per turn effects, just
Yeah.
resummon them like Armageddonite or something. In practice, turns out that's not what you do with this, right? Like there's
You
almost
still do in some decks, they just aren't meta relevant.
I'm not aware of any meta deck,
Right.
at least, that
Yeah.
makes use of it in that way, right? I'm
Infinity.
sure you can. Yeah, you. Okay, yeah, I said meta decks, but okay.
It won my locals last week, but yeah. So it's like the two main things with it. And just to, I guess, like if you want to think about the theme of it, I think it's really cool personally. If you imagine like it's World Sea Dragon Lord Atlantis, right? So it's like it creates like a tsunami, right? Like it's this wave that blows everything away, and then the tide comes back in, and all the monsters are resummoned to the field. Like thematically, that's kind of like what it's doing. I think that's a very cool aspect of it.
Oh, I do like that. I kind of wish they used Kairushin and you had some kind of retrained version of that card for
That
this.
would've
That
been
would have been
cool.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, this card feels great for sure. I can see it seeing a ton of play.
It is
Especially
very
if
strong at
full
the
field
moment. Yeah,
version.
it wasn't when it came out simply because there was no great application for it. We basically all looked at it and we were like, yeah, this card's great and it's going to be good eventually. And it has found a home now with some very particular interactions. But the reason I think personally why this card is so good and was just basically a ticking time bomb until it was incredibly powerful is the fact that it does break with the link mechanic in the way that it's the first time you can use a link 4 to summon another link 4.
Yeah,
Basically meaning that the way I look at this card is just you're adding this effect onto every single link 4 in the game, right? Like you can make a link 4, and on top of doing what that link 4 does, you also get this effect, right? So it's like a bonus effect, kind of almost like how Zodiacs were like summon one, then turn it into the next one. It's like you summon a link 4, use its effect or something, and then link it off for this to get this effect on top of it.
yeah, it's just always open to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that.
So in that sense, it was a very dangerous card when it came out. I think it came out in 2023. Maybe 2022, like late 2022. I'm pretty sure it's 2023 though. So it took like
October 2022, Darkwing Blast.
end of
into the
2022. So it
database.
didn't even take a year and a half for this card to completely break this is the way how like most current meta decks can just literally do 10,000 damage with one card because there's some combos with it.
10,000 damage is a large number.
It is a large number, yeah, and it is more than 8,000 importantly.
Yeah, I can see that being really, really cool card. Like, again, and as you mentioned, I think the main thing is that you could just turn any link 4 straight into it is
Yeah.
probably one of the biggest problems.
Yeah.
So do you see it as?
Well, not necessarily biggest problem, but like one of the alarm points for the card.
Do you see this as good or bad design? And what are the hallmarks of said good and bad design for something like this?
So I think in terms of how it can make you think about what combos and stuff you can play, because my mind immediately went to, can I abuse this first effect, which is apparently not how it got played. That's a good thing because it means then people run around and try different things with the card. They're excited to play with the card because you can tell there's something there, but you don't know what it is, and that gives you the opportunity to figure it out. I think the one thing that I'm not a fan of is that 1+ effect monster. I don't think that you should be able to turn your already used up Firewall Dragon or whatever into, well, that card got errata a long time ago, but like doing stuff like that, just being able to turn like Appaloozas like on your turn when you're like, okay, cool, I've got control of the game, I'm now going to switch over and kill you. I think that probably could have been still 2+ effect monsters would have been better than just you slide into this.
Yeah.
But in terms of like what it does, I like the idea that you can basically move all of your links around and then set up the co-link, so you no longer have to special summon in a way that gives you the best arrows. It's like you can just special summon the monsters in the best order for their effects and then rearrange them to set it up. Like with nightmares, you had to do it in a particular order because you're trying to get around the board to make the U link. If you were going for the full link, I think it was the technical term.
Yep.
But this is really cool design. Like this, giving people the opportunity to just run out and start trying stuff with Armageddon Knight or other similar cards. It may come up again as a big problem in the future, but it feels fun. Like
Yeah.
looking at it. That's the way I'd probably evaluate this card.
And chat really wants me to bring up this interaction, which is a little more niche, but is relevant in the decks for it. So let's say you apply a restriction to yourself, like I can only special summon waters for the rest of this turn. If you activate Zelantis and banish everything and then specials everything back, if your opponent has a full field of fire monsters, they're gone permanently because you cannot special waters. So it just completely removes all of their monsters. Just, yeah, full non-targeting banish of their field.
Oh, that is Yu-Gi-Oh level quirky. That is something the Pharaoh himself will come and go, but you can't bring your monsters back, Kaiba, because I said so. Like,
because I walk into waters.
yeah, I don't like stuff like that because it's like you just it's so obscure that you don't really find out about it until like the worst possible time when you're in a tournament, somebody does it to you, and then you're like, oh, okay, cool, I'll just bring my monsters. Oh, I can't. Oh. Yeah, you find out it's like it's not obvious looking at the cards that it says you special summon your opponent's cards back as well. I would have kind of liked it if that was not how the card worked, if I'm being honest, because you shouldn't need to have a PhD in order to understand dueling. Like it's a big ask, and like stuff like that is really funny when you first figure it out, but then like when you figure it out is always going to be the worst possible time. You're gonna just have between rounds going, "Oh, the guy sacked me," while you're eating your Subway at your locals, getting angry about it.
I'd argue it's even worse when it happens on something like Master Duel and you're just like on your own playing and your stuff just doesn't
And you
come
don't
back
understand.
without an explanation. You don't get any explanation. You're just like, where's my stuff?
Why game bug?
Oh, the game bugged.
Yeah, where game bug?
Or on Reddit, typing up a storm.
Oh god, yeah, it's that's even worse on Master Duel because I know on like Magic Arena, if an effect would prevent you from doing something, you try and do it anyway. The card causing it will start glowing red, so you can sort of then it doesn't tell you what's happened, but if you hover over the card, you can kind of piece together contextually that card was responsible for this. But it sounds like Master Duel doesn't just have this, so it's just like,
I don't think it
where's
does.
my board?
No, it doesn't. At least not in this instance. I don't think it'll show you like why it doesn't come back. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny but janky all at the same time.
I like how you put it into perspective of there are a lot of parts about this card's effect that are really cool, and I would agree with it. Like the idea of like flushing everything off the field and then bringing it back, and rearranging your arrows is pretty cool. And it's just this small thing that you can just make it with any link for that makes it a problem. It made me think of a different question really quick, which is we very often discuss about which is the problem card in a certain interaction, right? We're always thinking like, okay, a very simple example is like, for example, if there's a really powerful warrior monster out there, like is that card the problem, or is reinforcement of the army being at 3 like the problem, right? Because a lot of people argue currently, for example, they printed a reinforcement of the army for pyro monsters. Like level 4 or lower pyros. And that's being played in the best deck in the game at the moment, and people are calling for that card to be like on the Forbidden Limited list and so on and so forth. Currently, it's at 3, and the question is always like, is that card the problem, or is the card that it searches the problem, right?
Are you asking me as a game designer, or are you asking me as a product designer?
I guess give me both perspectives. I'd be interested in
Sure.
both.
So from game design perspective, hitting the consistency will allow you to will make it harder for those combos to go off, where you still get to experience the full value of your deck, but you're reducing the consistency that it happens, which means that your cards still hold value. You just get to do it less often in most cases. And the product answer to that is all of a sudden my deck no longer works. If you limit the cards in my deck that prevent me from actually, so I can search, I can't search for these cards anymore. You're hitting the problem, I guess, in that case. You end up in a situation where that feels much worse than just saying you do this less often versus you can't do this at all. In terms of, and it kind of it's weird because like technically having such an open-ended searcher is always going to be a hey, this is always going to be good as long as you're printing pyro monsters. But you've it's yeah, you also you have the business question of like, well, when did you release it? Is there a particular order that you release these cards? Have you just scheduled a reprint of said theme for like next set, and then there's all of a sudden it's like, oh, do you address the card that you just reprinted? That feels a little bit tricky. So you kind of from game design, like I understand the logic of just allow you to do it less consistently. Um, the game can feel a bit more luck sacky, but then in that case, you've got more of an opportunity for it to misfire and give you some stuff, but you still get to experience the full power of your deck versus, oh, I just can't play this deck anymore. Different people get mad for different reasons because the competitive format is built around having the slimmest amount of engine possible and maximum number of hand traps, it seems. So I guess like regardless of which card you hit, you're going to upset somebody.
I think I have a perfect example for you in this regard, and probably something you remember, which is Verte Anaconda, Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, and then Red Eyes Fusion.
Right.
So there's like this trifecta of like, okay, well, there's the Verte Anaconda that allows any deck to do this, but then there's also the end point of like, here's a really powerful boss monster that everyone is playing. Like, where is the issue? Is it the boss monster that's really oppressive? Is it the way you get to it? Or is it, you know, the 3-of fusion card that you can play in some decks that just splashes into anything that doesn't require normal summoning or special summoning immediately that turn, like, you know, Guru. It was really popular in 2000 and whatever, etc., etc.
That is an excellent question because the answer is kind of right depending on where you're looking at it from. Verde Anaconda being so open. If I remember that card, it was the Link to Plant monster that let you send Super Poly or let you send a fusion card from your
Fusion
deck to the
card, yeah.
graveyard, right? In that case, you kind of end up with the boss monster Red Eyes, if I remember, it was like you can't destroy it, Ring of Destructions you every turn and does something else.
And negates.
It negates.
Oh, it negates. And then fusion. Okay, and then fusion sends 2 card materials from the deck to the graveyard. So you just make the fusion, make the Anaconda, summon the. That boss monster is heavily pushed because if your opponent does pull off that cool combo, it's very difficult for you to out it, I guess, unless you were using a kaiju. Could you kaiju? You could kaiju it, right?
You
there wasn't any kind of restriction on that.
It's pretty resilient back in the day, yeah.
It's kind of like one of those old cards creating a sort of an unintended consequence, which would be Red Eyes Fusion. The real problem there is when Anaconda just being able to create those, being able to fish something like that out of the deck, because you've ruined the Red Eyes deck indirectly if you get rid of the Red Eyes Fusion. The boss monster shouldn't be that strong. That's part of a problem.
Really?
But you kind of end up with the Verdant Anaconda giving any deck such easy access is probably the easiest fix for it, where you can let people still have fun with their cards. But in an ideal world, you wouldn't have printed a card that was quite that difficult to get rid of, that also threatened you to win the game all by itself just by being summoned.
And what do you think of boss monsters? I think Apocalypse Towers might be a very good example. It was extremely oppressive back in the day. We've had a couple of iterations over the course of, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan. Masterpiece, I think, definitely comes to mind. You know, these kind of game-winning cards that if you don't have an immediate draw the out type of situation with, you could just auto lose immediately.
Yeah, that's it's actually super interesting because the TCG in Europe had a different problem with towers than the US did, because I think it was one of the promos
Dive and
rank
Crab
4
King.
crab could out it, and we didn't have it because it was a jump promo. So it ended up creating for the WCQ in Dublin this weird format where Tower Turbo was a very viable deck. In fact, it was so viable, a large number of competitive players that were on that deck went around Ireland or Dublin and bought out all copies of the special edition, so nobody could get access to Clee Towers, I think it was. Like they just wanted to make sure sort of that it was just them that was on the deck.
Buying out the competition, that's insane.
Some of the lengths that some of the players will go to, like when they get onto this tech, and they'll just make sure that no one else could be on it. It was insane. Clee, I don't like cards that you just can't interact with because you can't even really be clever. It's just because it's just so resilient. You should get a reward payoff for boss monsters, but it shouldn't just be a yeah, the game is over now because I played my card. That's when you start getting into the territory again where it's just like I do my turn one board, you don't get to play the game at all. Or you need to print outs. They don't have to be efficient outs, but they have to be actually playable outs. Like an old Floodgate that was kind of similar was when people would summon Destiny Hero Plasma off of scapegoats, and then you'd be under like a skill drain lock and a big monster. And Soul Taker was it's not ideal, but it solves the problem and it's playable in the format in the Gladiator Beast format. It was just a playable out to it. That is fine. Is when you end up in a situation where it's like you don't have any viable playable outs to the boss. That's a problem, and then the boss probably shouldn't be that big. Like Masterpiece was that card was also a mistake. That should not have been. Sorry, I shouldn't say that card is too far pushed. I remember seeing some of your earlier streams, and you were not a fan of Masterpiece, if I remember Farfa. But stuff like that is it's unfun because like for one of the players, this is the challenge you get. It's like the person who summoned it feels great. Like they've just like pulled off this thing. It's like I've summoned Clee Towers, I've got everything set up. Yeah, I should win this I should win this round. Like they believe like in their head, like I should win this match because I fought this and I achieved this. But the opponent is just sat there like this is bull. Yeah, I won't swear on your stream, but I was like, this is like not great. I don't get to play the game at all because this card is overly pushed. Like boss monsters need to be impactful so people care about them to include them in the deck, but they shouldn't be so oppressive that you don't have any viable playable outs.
So this
even
is
if you end up having to play... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, sorry for interrupting you, but I just really wanted to make this point about, but that's the issue, right? Because when you have a game that is so short on game length, you know, you are put in an immediate situation where I have to immediately draw the out, at which point you have done this 3-4 card combo to make this big boss monster that's supposed to be this crazy wacky payoff, but now it's immediately outed, and because you've invested all of your resources into summoning it, you lose the game, but now I've drawn that out, so I win the game. I didn't draw the out, now I lose the game and you win the game. Like, I don't think there's a way to strike a balance sometimes with boss monsters.
I mean, there's a way to strike a balance where you make a card where its main purpose is not to be incredibly hard to out or to floodgate your opponent, but rather just create advantage, like an advantageous position for yourself because it provides interaction, right?
I suppose that calls into question how do you define boss monster, right? So there is like good monsters you end on, right? Like just look at, for example, you know, Burning Abyss back in the day, right? Like Dante is the boss monster, right? But it's not like oppressive, right? So
yeah, right. It's like it creates card advantage for you. It's like it puts you in a good position, but it doesn't like not by stopping your opponent from playing, right? Completely.
But when you think of boss monster, what do you think of? Like, do you think of like just good end point of your deck, or is there even a space for these kind of masterpiece tower style monsters?
Boss is not the right word for me because I'm thinking of anything I'm happy to like end my turn on, like a monster that I summon and that I want to remain on the field, right? It doesn't need to be something that's unoutable or stops my opponent from playing completely, but even something like, I don't know, quick effect, banish one of my opponent's cards or something
Fenrir.
like that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I said Fenrir. Sorry. Continue.
Oh, yeah, Fenrir is cool.
Sorry, I don't know Fenrir. I assume in context of.
Let me show you my friend Fenrir. No. Unironically, I have a much better card to show you in this regard. Sorry, I don't want to take up like all of your day because we have been here for a while, but it's just so interesting. So if you do want us to speed along, do let me know. But let me just show you this really quick and read it out and tell me what you think.
My suggestion. Okay, that's a good one. Show him that one, and then we. I think we can move on to the patron questions.
Yeah.
Or the
Mm. Oh, you want me to read it out? Sorry, yeah. Because
Yes.
otherwise, you're just gonna see me just staring into my
I
screen.
want to enjoy it again.
Yeah.
Three
I wanna-
level 7s, Machine XC effect, Dark rank 7.
Read the
Once
name.
per
Read the
turn,
name.
you
Read the
can also-
name.
Oh, God, this is gonna show off. I was terrible at always name pronunciation. Like that was the most embarrassing part of YCSs was announcing player names incorrectly. Kashira Arise Heart. Is that how you say it?
Yep.
That is the name. Yes.
Okay. Once per turn, you can also Exley summon this by using one Kashira monster you control. If a particular monster, Kashira Shangri-Ira, was successfully summoned, activated this turn, transfer those materials to this card. Any card sent to the graveyard is banished, Macrocosmos instead. Once per chain, each time a card is banished, attach one banished card to this card as a material. Once per turn, quick effect, attach 3 materials to this card. There's a distinct lack of once per turn on this card. Once per chain is dangerous. Any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead, once per chain, anytime card. So you can just keep putting materials on this as long as it's once per chain.
Yep. You
And
can
you just get to Xyz. You can just Xyz summon it, chucking it onto anything. I mean, I don't know how difficult it is to summon Kashira Shangiri Ira,
It's one card combo.
or what it does.
One card.
Oh, so you just basically one card summon this.
one
This
card
is
combos do
oppressive.
this. Yeah.
This is unbelievably oppressive. It's a Macrocosmos above all else. You don't have to draw it. It's not once per turn. It's once per chain. I hate that text so much.
Well, it's. I want to clarify the. I feel like the last sentence. It's not just Macrocosmos. It's also basically Trident.
Yeah, you can just like go ahead and snipe stuff in as a quick effect. Banish it face down as well, so it's just like dead. Oh god, this card. This card is disgustingly good. Did this warp a format by chance?
It's banned.
It's banned. Yeah. Okay. That kind of.
I don't know if it's. I'm not sure about the statistics, but it is definitely among the fastest cards to get banned. In Yu-Gi-Oh, it didn't even last a year.
So the most powerful deck ever in the history of this game is Tearlament. In a format with full power Tearlament, Kashtira was released. It was only one YCS. This deck still managed to take a third of top cut against the most powerful deck ever in the history of this game, just for context of how it could stand up to the deck, mostly because of the viability of Ride's Heart.
And then Tier got hit on the ban list significantly, and then it was basically Kashtira format, where it wasn't a Tier 0 deck, because that is the only good thing about Kashtira is you'll notice that nothing here says Omni Negate or anything like that. The deck didn't have anything like this, right? So it was able to be interacted with like any sort of like board breakers going second, right? It was possible. So there was room for other decks to compete, but it was still the most successful deck in the following formats. Like as long as this card was legal, Kashtira was very close to the best deck in the game.
This is a boss monster.
Insane.
It is a boss monster.
It's kind of weird. Like again, like when talking about bosses, it's like, does it capture the flavor of that? I don't know what Kashtira does, but was the
theme is
idea of
banishing.
banishing stuff face down a big part of it?
The entire Kashtira deck is about banishing your opponent's cards face down. Where like some of them banish, they even have cards that let you look at your opponent's extra deck to banish cards from it face down. They can banish from the field face down. They can banish from your graveyard face down. They can even banish from the top of your deck face down.
Did you play this with Diablos the Mine Hacker, the guy who eats?
Like yes.
Okay.
It's almost as if they took Diablosis and then made an archetype around Diablosis.
Yeah. That card's also banned, by the way.
What a surprise. I can imagine anybody who had a ultra rare prize card of that when this card came out was having a really good day. That's actually, this is disgustingly too powerful. And again, I think part of what would have probably have controlled the power creep of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is if you just made the extra deck monsters not better than the cards that go in the main deck. Because you don't have to draw them. Like if the main deck cards were better.
This to me feels like the perfect example of we're gonna make an archetype and we're gonna make sure it's good, right? Because
intentional design.
Yeah. It's like you can try to make a card good and interesting. This one is not. You're not attempting to make it interesting. You're just attempting to make it as powerful as you can.
Yeah.
So like just slap a floodgate and a removal effect on it.
Yeah, this card's disgustingly good.
So
Yeah, and I'm
the whole theme of the deck is basically to lock out your opponent's zones, because that's what Shangri-La does every time a card is banished face down. Here's a very iconic image for you to take a look at from a YCS feature match.
This is the final of a YCS, I think.
This is the yeah.
sorry, what's going on? So all of these zones can't be used,
They can't be used. I know.
including spells and traps. So all the
Yes.
spells and trap zones have been blocked out.
Yes.
Can't be used.
So Shangri-La
What?
banishes face down. Shangri-La triggers not once per turn when a card is banished face down. You get to choose a zone and you get to block it out. And yeah, you get this multiple. You can probably block like 3 or 4 zones in a turn, and then a couple more on your opponent's turn. You can very quickly put them down to like 1 monster zone or spell and trap zone. Basically by turn 2.
Yeah.
Did people do like break my board memes with this? And then just submit this image?
I mean,
Probably.
all kinds of content has been made with
But
this
it's
stuff.
when the
That's
break your board memes
insane.
actually become real is the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So wait, can you actually, if you get rid of a card that's blocking your zones, can you carry on playing, or is it just like they're locked?
The Shangri-La locks your zones as long as it's on the board.
Yeah,
So
if
like
you could
theoretically,
kaiju it or
if you-
something.
If
Yeah.
you were to
So
kaiju it,
Kaiju's Ra Sphere mode, that was kind of probably
yes,
main
you
side deck
could
at
do
that
that.
point.
Yeah.
Theoretically,
All decks
you
that
could.
play that.
Yeah, I've always really liked the Kaijus, but again, it's always trying to find that space of can they fit. But stuff like that is, again, that as the player on the other side of the table, that is just so awful. Like, it looks really cool when you're doing it, but you're just like, why did I even come here? Why did I get out of bed today? Like, that's savagery. If you're designing a game, if anybody in the audience is like designing a game, don't do stuff like this. This is not good.
Oh, but then how do you sell your cards? That's And so for context,
Well,
again, like this is the context is they needed to make a deck that would stand up to Tearlaments. The de facto, like until today, if you were to have all of those cards at 3, the best deck ever printed, ever. Like there is no deck that is stronger than Tearlaments. So how do you beat this graveyard fusion from deck type of pile that has a whole bunch of graveyard effects? You make a boss monster that is just Macrocosmos.
Yep.
So that is the context.
Yep.
Not sure what the story behind zone locking is, but
Yeah, I don't know. They
Yeah,
just
no,
wanted, they
okay,
just wanted to make a deck for Diablosis, it feels like.
I see the point. And it's kind of sad that things got to that situation. I don't know much about Tearlaments, you said, but it sounds like if you get into a point where you have a deck that powerful in the format, maybe you need to address that deck as opposed to print
Exactly.
something as ridiculous as that deck.
Here's a picture of a Tearlament feature match. That is not photoshopped, by the way. This is a legal game state of both players milling 10 cards and triggering a 10+ chain link interaction.
Oh, wait. So it's stuff that triggers when sent to the graveyard.
Yeah,
They had a lot of milling effects, but they were not. It didn't even feel like randomness because they were so consistent to the point that like it didn't even matter.
just imagine Lightsworn like powered to 11. Like it's yeah.
This must have took some real mental stamina to play 16 rounds of this in a tournament.
Unironically a good Yu-Gi-Oh format in the sense of like the skill it took. Like it is looked back upon as like one of the better Yu-Gi-Oh formats, even though it was a tier 0 format.
Mirror
But
match.
still,
that is.
obviously, audiences got tired of it because you kept seeing the same stuff, and it was hard to follow. If you weren't the one playing it, like it's hard to look at. But from that perspective, it was relatively complicated and rewarding to play. But from all perspectives, other than the one playing it at a high level, I can definitely see why people got tired of it relatively fast.
Yeah, I mean it's also part of it because then I guess if you're triggering stuff and your opponent's triggering stuff because you're milling
Both decks,
is it both players milling? It seems.
Yeah.
There's cards. There were cards that said send top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard. Yeah.
Okay. It's just a case of like when you get to that, you start going fundamentally against like whose turn is it anyway? Well,
Yeah.
in Yu-Gi-Oh, I guess
Well,
you
yeah.
can't start playing
Yeah,
that game.
yeah.
I
Mhm.
had a real problem with this in the Monarch format when you had the new Monarchs printed and you could
Mhm.
tribute some of them in your opponent's turn.
Mhm.
And because the interactions took so long to resolve, you could get
Mhm.
to the end of the chain and be like, "Sorry, is it my turn or is it your turn?" Like that became a legitimate question. This- ooh,
You are
that
not ready to see a branded end phase, I'm telling you that.
branded end phase.
This is as worst as it
Yeah.
gets, I think, for interactions. Like
Yeah, no,
literally, like you know,
the branded meme is branded is a deck that has a lot of triggers in the end phase where like you think they're done with their turn and then they get to the end phase and they play for like 5 more minutes.
yeah, we like to call these
Yeah, I
decks
guess
main
it's
phase 3.
main phase free. That's an excellent name for a YouTube channel, by the way. If anybody wants to snatch that one up. Um, that's maddening. Like, and that's a legal game state. Were you play? I guess you couldn't play that grass looks greener, right? That was long
No,
gone by
That
this
was
point.
long banned, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say 60 cards with that grass looks. Well, everyone would be playing 60 cards. Like, were you playing 60 with this, or were you just playing core 40?
No, it was like close to 40, this one.
So is that short? I guess because you need to keep hitting the chains of
See, the thing
cards.
is the deck milled a lot, but it also they thought of that in designing because the Tearlaments, when they were sent to the graveyard, they would perform a fusion summon by putting the materials back to the bottom of the deck, so they would never deck out.
Come on. Okay, yeah. I mean, it's a cool idea.
Yeah.
But kind of that was like then there was an anime theme that reminded me of fusing from the graveyard. Fossil fusion. That's probably a little
Mhm.
bit different. This is kind of more like a Ishizu kind of
Yeah,
thing, reverse worlds.
They
also
had
sort of like
Ishizu
a
cards
very
because
miracle fusion type of thing. This was really crazy because, and I think the reason why this deck is so powerful and where future power creep could go is when you're using resources for free, right? Because you're milling and then you perform a fusion summon by using the cards you just milled, and then those go back to the deck. So you're getting a bunch of triggers basically off the top of your deck, just yeah, out of nowhere basically, which is I think one of the most dangerous parts of milling as a design point.
Yeah.
Mm.
I actually remember we had a JY Sheriff on a live stream. He was playing that
Lightsworn
grass looks
Zombie.
greener and pretty
Yeah.
much Lightsworn Zombie in every format, and
Yeah.
you could see how much he was abusing Fairy Tale Snow and just free resources that you could
Oh
just
yeah.
get from the virtue
Oh
of
yeah.
milling them. It
Mm.
becomes very difficult to balance unless you start getting very heavy-handed with the FNL list because you're just getting resources out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Mm.
That card is
Um,
also banned now.
yeah, it makes sense. I remember it was legal on Master Duel, and it
Oh
was
yeah, it
still
still is
felt.
in
It's
Master
League of
Duel, but
Master,
in
yeah.
TCG it's banned, yeah.
All right, shall we do Patreon question?
Let's do some Patreon questions. This is really so interesting. I feel like this could go on for forever, and I wouldn't get tired of asking about different periods of the game. But
I know. It's
yeah,
thank you so much for your time, honestly. So
Oh,
yeah,
honestly, I'm
this
glad to be here.
yeah, really appreciate you, and of course we'll give you one more chance as well to plug your game once we wrap up. But let's ask this question here. So again, we didn't touch on the ban list at all. Probably one of the most sensitive parts of your contract, and not being able to talk too much about it, but do answer where possible. When designing a ban list, keeping the cost and reprinting of cards aside, what is a designer's train of thought? Do you ban cards that are overperforming than what you had expected, or do you take a look at the metagame and say, is what this card is doing healthy or not, or will it be corrected in the future?
Okay. So yeah, let me think very carefully with this.
Take your time.
I'm not a fan of printing cards that you know you're going to have to address later with the Forbidden Unlimited list.
Mhm.
That is we printed this a while ago, and it's interfering with future card design. We should find ways to limit these interactions, or say, okay, this card is now just too dated. We should not be playing with this. I
Mhm.
don't think printing a card that is so far pushed that you say, "Oh, don't worry, we'll just ban that in like a year or two."
Mhm.
I think that's really bad business practice, and it's really poor design for the players. Because if you end up then buying a bunch of cards, and it happened to me actually as a player, this situation. So Power of the Duelist was Chimeratech Overdragon's sort of premiere set, and you had Future Fusion, Pre-Errata, Overload Fusion, and the deck was so consistent of creating like OTKs. And this is back in upper deck. Oh, I just slipped it somewhere.
He said
Back in upper
dick.
deck era. I'm still mad about this. I traded like my whole collection into this Cyber Dragon Chimeratech Overfusion deck because
Mhm.
I'd done all the math and stuff. I was like, yeah, I'm super into this. And then for the first time since Upper Deck was ever making FNL lists, they moved the date from when they did it. It used to be like October, and I was like, I'm gonna get at least a month of regionals with this. They moved it from October to September, and they like gutted the Overload Fusion deck like immediately. And I
Mhm.
was like, oh my god! And I've just traded all of my cards into this, like from my collection. So
Mhm.
I got savagely burned like that. But in
Mhm.
that situation, that should have never happened to me as a player when the set's literally just gone out on the shelf, and it's like your collection's already devalued. You've obviously printed cards that you knew are going to be a problem later, and I don't think you should be doing it.
Mhm.
And the sad thing is like there's business reasons that you can do it, but it ends up churning your players, like, and people get mad about it, and it's not morally right to do it. Um, Printing
Yeah.
overly pushed stuff that you intend to address later.
Mhm.
So what you want to do is look at, do we have this interaction that's making it so we have to power creep the game in order to keep printing cards? If yes, that card probably should be addressed. Is this part of a broken combo that stops a player from playing the game and is too consistent? Yeah, okay, we probably need to address it.
Mhm.
And that's how the FNL list should be used, in my opinion. Again, this
Mhm.
only ever reflects what I'm saying. This doesn't reflect
Yeah.
anything else. Just for clearness, is that
Yeah.
a full answer? If you do you want to you want me to elaborate on any part of that?
Well, I suppose just
Yeah.
maybe where, it feels like because of the paradox of power creep, every card you make, every new deck you make, every new meta deck you make will always have that ticking time bomb effect, right?
Yeah.
So I,
Yeah.
as a player right now, just I don't know how others feel, but as Yu-Gi-Oh players, I think we mostly just feel like, okay, I'm gonna buy this deck. It's gonna be worthless in 8 months, probably. That's just how the cycle is now. We've just sort of accepted it.
I mean, that is something that is the same even if you have something like a rotation in place, right? There's like other games where that is the norm, right? You never expect your
Mm.
deck to last more than 1 or 2 years or something.
I think
Um,
Yu-Gi-Oh has a shorter lifespan significantly, to an
Potentially,
extent,
yeah.
right?
Depending on which period of Yu-Gi-Oh you look at, right? There is certain decks that have lasted you for a longer time, maybe not as the best deck in the game, but certainly still remain playable or something. But the thing I wanted to, or maybe wanted you to elaborate on is because you said like stuff that's problematic obviously needs to get hit, but like what about stuff that is just like been around for a relatively long time? And if you wanted to sell new cards, they would have to significantly be power crept, right? Like even if the deck maybe itself is in a fine spot right now, are you still a fan of hitting it just because it's been out there for a while? And rather than power creeping it, I would just like tone it down a bit so that my next archetype doesn't have to be power crept, right? Just like slow down that process a little bit.
I
In
think
an ideal situation,
I just wanted to give
sorry,
you an
go ahead.
example. So, and a perfect
Mhm.
example of that would maybe be if you recall during Invasion Vengeance, there was sort of like Metalfoes as like one of the best decks, ABC. And then it was
Hmm.
like people wanted
Yeah.
these decks hit. Even maybe we need to hit like DDD, which was like kind of good at the time and stuff like that. But
Hmm.
then Raging Tempest came out with Zodiac, so it was all irrelevant. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
just an example, I suppose.
Yeah. So again, trying to think of how I can answer this. There's always future context that the players never really get when it comes to designing FNL lists and what the
Yeah.
format's going to do. The designers know if there's like new mechanics coming out, if there's new archetypes that kind of interact with this in a certain way. That forward information, that you have access to it. Um, Again, I've got to be very careful what I say here.
Hmm.
Um, so that is definitely always something that can be in consideration. But
Okay.
to Josh's point, I'm in favor of toning stuff down. I don't like outright killing stuff. I feel like
Hmm.
that it you basically you end up in a weird situation where it's more economic to rent your deck from eBay for a YCS and then relist your cards immediately afterwards. Like go to the event, play with the cards you want, and then sell them, and then wait till the next event to re-rent them. You end up in a situation where that might become sort of like the norm for players, and that feels really awkward.
Hmm.
Where you are so worried that anything that's meta relevant is going to get heavily slapped because it's too far pushed.
Hmm.
Uh, and if you tone stuff down and it's still playable, it's obviously it doesn't have to be tier one, but I think some of the steps, like I think Tom Rose was on ABC or Burning Abyss for like forever,
Burning Abyss.
regardless of how many changes in the formats, and was still performing really well at YCS. That's an example of a deck being addressed in the right ways, where it was still viable if you really wanted it hard enough, but it wasn't um, completely gutted and destroyed just so you get people off of it. and I think that was kind of like an example of it be done right. But we are. It seems like they're entering a stage when you show me some of this stuff where you're printing cards that are just so unbelievably game warping in order to move players onto stuff. That would be really challenging to go out with a straight face and talk to like the players and be like, yeah, we knew this was going to be a problem. Like that, you don't want to ever be in a position where you're doing that, really.
Mhm.
So toning it down is the preferred way of handling it. And the way that's usual to that is to hit the consistency to say you can still have your power plays, but you're just not going to be pulling it off at a high enough percentage at a tournament level for you to seriously want to play that deck.
Mhm.
All right. I guess this is pretty good. I suppose one like really final point I forgot to bring up was we didn't talk too much about product specifically, but I think an interesting point is the TCG OCG differences in their boxes. So OCG has 20 less cards in their card pool. Their packs have less commons, and they retail for lower. As a TCG player, when you look at this, you kind of think to yourself, well, not even just like, you think objectively, mathematically, you are getting more bang for your buck.
And I want to add to this that like even the high rare cards are available in different
Of
rarities.
course, yeah.
Just for context, something that I personally also wasn't aware of, but I've been looking into getting cards for my own content from the OCG so I can play test them before they release in the TCG. And I got the full set of Rage of the Abyss in a playset for I think around $200, and that is the full set times 3 in lowest rarity. Just to put it into a perspective of like, like do with that information whatever you will, but I've gotten my hands on those, and that is including like the cost of course like importing it, like so on
Delivery,
and so
shipping,
forth.
etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is like maybe just under a playset of Engraver, like the new 3 of like starter card you play in the current format. Kind of unheard of, I think, in TCG. So the differences in the product, I think, sometimes can be a bit of a frustrating point when we look at like, well, they get such a better deal than us.
Sure. Again, let me think of the answer I can give.
Mhm.
It's kind of weird to say that the consumers in Japan and in the West, they will behave differently in
Yeah.
terms of how they make purchasing decisions. And if you look on a macro level, I'll because I don't really want to talk about too much the ins and outs of doing
Mhm.
it in Konami, but if a company keeps doing something, it's because it's usually working.
Yeah.
Uh, So that's kind of an indirect way of answering in the way that you all probably can kind of figure it out.
Mhm.
Like for example, the star packs that were really relevant to competitive players. Konami didn't accidentally keep releasing those. Like it wasn't like, oh, let's just keep making flops. Like it was working. That's why
Mhm.
we did multiple iterations of it.
Mhm.
Um, and what you kind of end up with is like if it makes sense to release your products in a certain way, you've got all of your SKUs and everything set up. Sorry, stock controlled units and everything, and it's an accepted product.
Mhm.
You keep doing it that way. And there's other things that come into play, like things like how much space you take up on the shelf. You notice like whenever you look at the US products, they're so much bigger. It's because they're designed like you got to consider Walmart specs. Like, are you going to see it on a shelf? Like Walmart will say, "We'll give you this much space," and you're like, "I'm going to use all of it." There's a lot of extra stuff, like even differences between European and US product. But I'm never going to be able to really give you the satisfactory answer that you want. I'd say is
Yeah, that's fine.
you just
I
kind of
mean,
have to watch
we
if they
yeah,
keep doing it. It's because it's working for them.
Yeah. Okay.
If that kind of nods to everybody
I
in
mean,
that
yeah,
case.
that is something that obviously we knew that, right? It's not like a new development. Like it's been like that in 2008 already, Dark Arm Dragon, Judgment Dragons of the
Yeah.
world, right? So it is something we know it's working, right? And so they keep repeating the thing that's working rather than changing it up. Um
Yeah.
but yeah, I wanted to bring this up to you specifically because I know you were like behind Speed Duels, or you were behind Speed Duels, and Speed
Yeah.
Duel did it in a very different way where like I don't even think there was booster packs for Speed Duel, right? It was like you bought the box and you got the guaranteed card pool of cards to play with. And I was wondering if you ever thought that that was something you can do on a bigger scale for Yu-Gi-Oh maybe to to that extent, but they like why were you guys willing to do that with Speed Duel but not with like regular sets maybe to try it out once?
So you will actually the start of Speed Duel did start with booster packs. Actually, we did have booster
Oh,
packs
okay.
initially, um, like Attack the Deep and stuff like that. They were kind of named after Yu-Gi-Oh
Mhm.
episodes, some of them.
Okay, I didn't know that
And
actually.
the
I just remember the recent,
problem,
yeah.
the problem that I kind of had with it was that it wasn't resonating with the players at all. Like
Mhm.
it wasn't working as a booster product.
Mhm.
And then the idea of like, well, who is this actually targeting? It's targeting a group of friends who love the anime, or maybe people that play speed duels and just kind of want to have a group sit down and play a casual alternate format. So
Mhm.
why not build it as sort of more like a board game, where you essentially get all of the content in
Mhm.
the one box, and it's all guaranteed. And then you had some of the promo cards were randomized,
Mhm.
and that really worked because it resonated with the players that cared about that style of game.
Mhm.
Uh, it you can, I would guess, because I left, so I never really got to see the sales numbers or anything from that. But they did continue to release the Speed Duel box sets for a couple of years after I left. So I have to
Mhm.
assume that the Battle City box set was a product that resonated with players. In fact, I so much believe in it. Robot Raiders is built around that concept that everything that you get is in the box for people
Yeah,
to
there's
play and
no
have the
like
full
yeah,
experience.
randomness, no you need to pull
There's
the stuff. Yeah.
there's no booster packs, and that is a very like successful business model.
Mhm.
And obviously it's been done by so many card games and stuff. It it's bad because it preys on people who, it's not that they want to collect cards. It does prey a little bit on people that need it. Like that's like the thing where like I need to build my
Mhm.
collection. I need this thing. The gacha systems in like mobile games as well, they're very predatory in that sense. And I really liked that Speed Duel was like, we're a group of friends that want to play classic Yu-Gi-Oh! I want to have the fantasy. I want my Serpent Knight Dragon to, well, that's not from the Battle City box set, but like I want my Serpent Knight Dragon to actually feel like it was cool in the anime.
Mhm.
Or I want my Jinzo to be a bit more interactive.
Mhm.
And that particular product worked extremely well with the audience that cared about Speed Duel. Um, and that's why I built it that way, and that's why I've built Robot Raiders in a similar way, because I think
Mhm.
that's more fair for the consumer. It is not the most effective way of making money.
That's fair.
If you
Yeah.
did booster packs and stuff, but so many games have tried to establish themselves. Like you can look at all the Bandai games, and they keep cycling through those pretty fast. You can look at things like Flesh and Blood. It's so hard to get the space in the stores because people are sick of trading card games because they run for 2 or 3 years and then get cancelled because they just don't have a big enough fan base. There's only a certain number of games that could be that can support you needing to go back and buy a whole new deck every couple of months or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but I would have liked to have seen more sets where it's like I don't know, the deck builder packs instead was like a Battle City box set, where it's like cool, yeah, we've just got like 3 complete decks or
Mhm.
set up to 4 complete decks from the deck builder packs, and you can just go ahead and play it as sort of like straight out of the box. You have everything you need. I
Mhm.
think that would be pretty cool, but it's more efficient what they're doing than doing that in terms of hitting your targets and stuff, I would
Mhm.
imagine. So that's why they keep doing things the way they do.
Yeah. But would you say from a company perspective, there's a chance that they ever like try something else and it also works and they keep doing it that way? Like if they keep getting feedback or if they keep seeing other games, maybe come up and be kind of viewed as a threat to them? Like, do you think there's a chance they will try something and it works out and so they keep changing or keep reiterating on it?
I mean, yeah, when the bottom line starts getting effective, you'll be surprised how flexible companies can be.
Okay.
Where if players just stopped, I'm not going to encourage this because obviously people love the game, but if people just stop buying stuff, you'll notice that it changes pretty quickly. People's careers and livelihoods depend on people wanting to love Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, put it in perspective, and this is something that came up a lot when I was working there. Is like everyone was like, "Oh, do you have to be like a really good duelist or something?" And the answer is like, my job was to never be the world's best duelist. It was to make you want to be.
Mhm.
Like, and people need to understand that as a flip on the situation. And
Yeah.
if I have to adjust because the market isn't actually interested in buying that, then things will change. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I see the slash sarcasm, Matt, encouraging a boycott. I'm not, but if you basically, however the market is reacting to stuff will affect how things change. If everything is great, then buy more product, and then things will stay the same. But the new stuff does get tried from time to time, like things like the advent calendars, like that sort of tried and that worked. There's been other products that have come out, new rarities and stuff like that added, and they've been successful. So you just continue, you continue doing it.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, the market is kind of controlled by you, the players, or
Okay.
the community in general.
Which is a great segue into a game that has pre-made booster boxes and sets. Matt, tell us one more time about...
Sure. Robot Raiders. It is a 1 to 4 player dungeon crawling card game. I talked a little bit earlier, but for anybody who's just like joined the stream a little bit later, the idea, I actually have the prototype I got made here, so we've been demoing this around the country. You have one player who's playing an overpowered deck, that's the monster player, and then you have 3 raiders who play as the robots, and they're working together to overcome the raid. And as you go through the dungeon, you're going to level up, you're going to get new cards, you're going to get loot, and the idea is that you kind of have that whole dungeon crawling experience and working together as a team to overcome bosses that get increasingly more difficult. And they have new abilities. And then the boss player also gets options to change the game. It is a all in the box card game. Like you get this, it has everything that you need to play. And if we release new raids in the future for Robot Raiders, the new robots, you'll be able to bring them into the old raid. You'll be able to bring the monsters into the new robots. The idea is that it was all going to be modular. So that if you have a bigger collection, it's more fun, but you don't need it. Everything should be standalone to play. In fact, what would probably actually be really good, and not for today, is we could grab you guys and one extra player, and you could play against me on Robot Raiders on Tabletop Simulator, and we can have the 3 of you versus me, and I can give you a full run through. You give your community a bit of a run through the game. You get an idea about my game design process, faults, and stuff like that.
Sure.
That could be fun.
That does sound fun. No, that's the minimum we can do for you coming onto the podcast and answering all of our questions.
I would...
Honestly, no, I'm very grateful.
I think it's hard enough to have MBT on my team and also have him as a enemy. So that sounds very workable.
But yeah, like for anybody who wants to check it out, head over to robotraiders.com. You can sign up to the mailing list, and you'll get sent a demo, so you can even see before you even like look at anything buying it. Like you can play the demo game and understand, is this something I'll be into? We do have on our Discord channel, which you'll get sent a link to in the email. You can watch some videos of some demos I've done for people, and if you're really interested in learning to play and you're like, oh, I need a demo, I don't really get the rulebook or something, just ping me on the Discord. I will sit down with you and your group. I will do a demo. If you don't have Tabletop Simulator, I will stream me playing it so that you guys can get an idea. But yeah, I guess the way I'd describe it is if you think of the Bonds Beyond Time format of like player playing overpowered cards and then 3 players trying to beat them, that's what Robot Raiders is. If you have to do a very fast elevator pitch, so a little bit like Slay the Spire, Diablo meets Yu-Gi-Oh kind of thing, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
Okay.
Yeah, sick. Thank you for being here, Matt. As always, it's amazing to hear from you and to see this amazing adventure you've gone on with this project. And I honestly wish you the greatest and best of success with it. So hopefully you guys in the chat and listening elsewhere will check out the description for all the relevant links, potentially sign up and get yourself a demo and a tour of Matt's game. So all well and good.
Yeah, that was a long episode. Thank you for joining us for this talk. It was very, very interesting and insightful. And yeah, you guys, I guess we are finally coming to an end, even though I know there's hundreds of more questions that we could have asked. But we tried to navigate it as good as we could. Hopefully you enjoyed the little bit of an insight Matt was able to provide. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the episode.
And thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and demo this and just sort of catch up and talk a little bit about Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah,
Was such a big part of my life, so it's always fun to sort of go over the little tidbits that I can talk about.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. It's our honor. So again, check the description for anyone who has missed out and would like to get a shot at Robo Raiders. And of course, this has been a nice little deep dive into the understanding of game design and product design from Matt Bell. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Peace out. And until the next episode, take care.
bye-bye.